Committee is in session. The chair recognizes Mr. Deutsch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Attorney General Barr, you just told us that nothing was ever elevated to me. You had said in an interview recently that there's a process in place, an escalation system. It's the AG's responsibility to resolve it. How was this elevated to you, the case of Roger Stone?
On Monday, February 10th, the U.S. Attorney was with me, and he raised the issue with me.
So it was elevated by Timothy Shea?
Yes.
And had it been elevated during the 2 months between the time the conviction came in under the former U.S. Attorney and the time that Timothy Shea started?
I think Shea may have had conversations with people in the...
Did you ever have conversations with the former U.S. Attorney about this case? About the sentencing?
Stone. I don't recall any discussion about Stone.
Right. So Timothy Shea, you said in the interview that he was new, he had just started. He was new, but he worked for you for a long time, didn't he?
Yes.
And what was his job for you?
Well, when I was Attorney General 30 years ago, he worked...
No, now, just now.
He was on my staff.
He advised you on criminal justice policy and law enforcement, right?
Correct.
And you named him acting U.S. Attorney. Had you discussed the Stone case with him before you named him acting U.S. Attorney?
No.
Did you discuss sentencing with him? Not before. The first time was when he came in. It wasn't Monday, actually. Just to refresh your recollection, in a prior interview, you said he came in the week before. He came in to see some senior staff.
No, that's what I said. He may have had discussions with people in the deputy's office. I was not involved in those discussions. Basically, I didn't, as far as I can recall, I had no substantive involvement in Stone until that Monday when he came in the morning.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Attorney General, the week before when he came in to see the senior staff that he had worked with the week before when he was working on
I said I think he had raised it with people in the deputy's office. That's senior staff too.
Right, I understand.
But I was not involved.
He started on July 31st. The first week he was there, he came to raise this issue.
I think he started February 1st.
Right. Yeah. The first week he was there, he came into your office to raise the issue of sentencing. In the interview you did with ABC, you said
I don't think he came.
That's what you told ABC News. You said that he's talked to senior staff, not you perhaps, but he talked to senior staff. I don't know what,
I think I speak English. I said that before he came in to see me, I believe he had some conversations.
Conversations with senior staff, right. That's right, before he came to see you. We're saying the same thing.
But the first it was raised with me.
Was on Monday.
Was on Monday.
Did you talk to the senior staff after they spoke with him?
I think at a 9 o'clock meeting, they said that he was trying to work something out on sentencing, and he was actually optimistic that something could be worked out. So I didn't really think of it as an issue until that Monday when he told me that prosecutors...
He filed the sentencing memo, and the sentencing memo called for 7 to 9 years. It's the policy of the U.S. Attorney's Office to suggest a specific guideline range, which they did, and then you overruled the line prosecutors. They asked for a lower sentence, and you gave some reasons. You talked about health. Health is to be considered only for an extraordinary physical impairment. Did that apply to Roger Stone, Mr. Attorney General? That's what the guidelines said.
Well, actually, I can't reveal all the information.
I'm not asking what his health was, but did that apply?
No.
Okay, and did what
apply?
His health. Was that the reason?
Health is a reason to take
I know. Is that the case? Is that the reason for Roger Stone? You're asking for a lower sentence. Let me go on. It says age. Let me go on. Hold on 1 second. Age can be consideration. It says only if it creates conditions that are of an unusual degree and distinguish the case from typical cases. He was 67.
The judge agreed with me, Congressman.
No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm not asking you that.
The judge agreed with me.
I'm not asking whether.
I know you're not asking.
I'm not asking you that. And the issue here is whether Roger Stone was treated differently because he was friends with the president. When you asked to reduce the sentence, you said enhancements were technically applicable. Mr. Attorney General, can you think of any other cases where the defendant threatened to kill a witness, threatened a judge, lied to a judge, where the Department of Justice claimed that those were mere technicalities? Can you think of even one?
The judge agreed with our analysis.
Can you think of even one? I'm not asking about the judge. I'm asking about what you did to reduce the sentence of Roger Stone.
Yes.
Can you think, Mr. Attorney General, He threatened the life of a witness.
And the witness
and
said
you
he
view
didn't
that
feel
as
threatened.
a technicality, Mr. Attorney General. Is there another time
Can I
when
answer
that
the
has
question?
happened?
Can I have just a few seconds to answer
Sure.
the question?
I'm asking if there's
Okay.
another time
In this
all
case,
the time of the Justice Department.
the judge agreed
You
with
won't
our
answer my question,
the
Mr.
judge
Attorney
agreed
General,
with
and
our-
it's unfortunate. And the appearance is that, as you said earlier, this is exactly what you want. The essence of rule of law is that we have one rule for everybody, and we don't in this case because he's a friend of the president's. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Ms. Roby.
Mr. Attorney General, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm a member of both this committee as well as the Appropriations Committee, and I've been able to see firsthand both the funding and the operation of the department. Additionally, before I was elected to Congress, I served on the City Council in my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama. And I've witnessed the importance and the value of various Justice Department grant programs and the resources to state and local governments. For example, the Alabama Fusion Center, which is designed to combine information between federal, state, and local government, private sector entities, and the intelligence community, has been a recipient of these federal grants. And the Alabama Fusion Center is also responsible for the Alabama Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and has done a great job in work in combating child exploitation. Do you believe that Congress is adequately funding programs that provide state and local agencies with the tools that they need to be effective in preventing and pursuing crimes such as child exploitation and human trafficking, particularly over the internet?
I think we could always use more resources for that, Congressman, but if I could just have a moment of your time to respond to these questions
Sure.
here on that were being asked about the Roger Stone sentencing. The U.S. Attorney came to me and said that the 4 aligned prosecutors were threatening to resign unless they could recommend 7 to 9 years. But there was no comparable case to support that. It would have been a very disparate sentence. All the cases were clustered around 3-year sentence for that. And the way they had gotten to the 7 to 9 was by applying an enhancement. And there are debates all the time within the Department of Justice about the proper calculations under the guidelines and whether a particular enhancement applies or doesn't apply. And those are usually worked out and resolved. But here they were saying that they were taking an enhancement that has traditionally been applied to mafioso and things like that, threatening a witness, and they were applying it to him because he had a phone call at night where he told a witness that if you want to get it on, let's get it on, and I'll take your dog. And we felt that that technically could apply, but in this case, it really didn't reflect the underlying conduct. And the overarching requirement at the Department of Justice is that we do not presume and automatically apply the guidelines. We make individual assessments of the defendant and what is really just under the case, and nothing that is excessive. And these individuals were trying to force the U.S. Attorney, who was new in the office, to adopt 7 to 9. And I made the decision, no, we are going to leave it up to the judge. And that later, when that was not done, that evening, I told people we had to go back and correct that the next morning. So that's the sequence of events. But at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The judge said she would not have gone along, she didn't think, with the first recommendation because the enhancement artificially inflated the exposure of the defendant. And she came out exactly where I had come out. So at the end of the day, the question is fairness to the individual. And even though I was going to get a lot of criticism at the end of for doing that, I think at the end of the day, my obligation is to be fair to the individual. Thank you for permitting me.
Yeah, I'm happy to have yielded you time to respond. That being said, Mr. Attorney General, as I am a departing member of Congress and have just a few short moments left, I just want to express to you in the department how important this issue that I originally asked you about is to me, both as a member of Congress representing my constituents in Alabama, but also as a mother of two beautiful children. And I am increasingly alarmed about the way that children are just one click away from being on a website, a forum, or a chat room, or a social media site where bad actors may be lurking. And whereas I only have a few short seconds left, I would just ask you in the time that I have left in Congress that we could continue to work together to combat child exploitation and human trafficking. And I appreciate all the work that you're doing on this.
Absolutely, Congresswoman. And as you know, one of the most difficult issues coming up is encryption, because as this material gets encrypted in the chat rooms and the areas where they groom these young children, once it becomes encrypted, it'll be very hard for us to police it.
Right. Thank you so much. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Bass?
Attorney General Barr, when it comes to police engagement, last August when speaking to the National Fraternal Order of Police, you shared your views on police engagement with the public. You stated, and I quote, "Underscore the need to comply first, and if warranted, complain later. This will make everyone safe, the police, suspects, and the community at large, and those who resist must be prosecuted. I repeat, zero tolerance for resisting police. This will save lives." Do you stand by that statement?
Yes, I think it's very important.
A zero tolerance attitude is costing lives, not saving them, especially in communities of
Well,
color.
I'm not saying that.
I reclaim my time. A movement and protests have arisen in response to police brutality. Here are a few examples of who bears the cost of zero tolerance. Elijah McClain was walking home from a convenience store when he was approached by police. He had not committed a crime. Police held him in a chokehold for 15 minutes, then injected him with ketamine, not under a doctor's supervision, but at the direction of non-medically trained and unlicensed police officers. Are you familiar with that case?
No.
Do you know how frequently ketamine is used by law enforcement to subdue civilians, especially people of color?
No.
Did you know if police departments have been documented as directing paramedics and EMTs to inject ketamine during arrests?
No.
Well then, I guess you haven't evaluated the use of force tactics since becoming AG, and especially this particular tactic of subduing suspects with ketamine.
Not with respect to ketamine, no.
Will you commit to directing the department to evaluate the protocols around the use of ketamine, chokeholds, and other methods used by federal law enforcement officials when making arrests or detaining subjects?
Well, absolutely. Under the president's executive order, we are reviewing
Thank you. And especially
use of force and working with police departments.
Especially the ketamine. That's
I'll look
pretty
into
outrageous. George Floyd was killed by a police officer via a chokehold. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a police officer knelt on his neck as he begged for his life. He was suspected of using a counterfeit $20 bill. That's how zero tolerance can amount to a death sentence for black men when used in communities of color. With George Floyd screaming, as we all know, he couldn't breathe. Now consider James Holmes, who murdered 12 people and injured 70 others in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, the same town as Elijah McClain, where he was arrested. James wore body armor, had a knife, semi-automatic weapons, and an AR-15. Yet he was calmly arrested by the same police department as Elijah McClain without a chokehold or an injection of ketamine. Dylan Roof used a gun to murder 9 people and injured another at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina. When he was arrested, no chokeholds, no injections. He was treated so well that officers brought Dylan Roof Burger King after arresting him. Are you familiar with that case?
Yes.
I raised those 2 examples to follow up on what my colleague from Texas highlighted earlier, that the department is not doing enough to address issues of racism, bias, and brutality in law enforcement. When someone who commits mass murder is calmly arrested and served Burger King, while a young man walking down the street is placed in a chokehold and injected with ketamine, then dies. You said that under the executive order, the administration is looking at chokeholds. What have you determined so far?
Well, we're setting up a system of certification of police departments, and part of what our charter is to come up with criteria that will be used for certification, including limitations on use of force, specifically including chokeholds.
So in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, part of it called for a national registry of law enforcement officers as a resource for police chiefs to determine who are the best candidates for jobs. As you may or may not be aware, Tamir Rice might be alive today if the police chief who hired him had known that that police officer had been fired from another department. What is your view of a national registry of law enforcement officers?
The second aspect of the president's executive order is to set up a database like that so that all determinations of excessive force around the country go into that database, and if police departments aren't reporting that information, they wouldn't be certified. So we do believe in one national point where you can go in and get determinations of excessive force on law enforcement candidates for jobs.
Good, thank you. And I do want to comment on part of your opening statement when you were saying that after the Jim Crow period, that our justice system was equal. And I don't believe that that's the case.
I said the laws were made equal.
The laws are made equal. They are certainly not applied equally. We do have systemic problems in our law enforcement system, our criminal justice system on every level. The fact of the matter is 2.3 million people in the United States are incarcerated. We incarcerate 24% of the world's prisoners. 34% are black, while African Americans are just 13% of the U.S. population. So justice is still not equal, nor are our laws. And I think when we look at how many people are incarcerated or how many people are killed, it is not the numbers, it is the percentage to the percentage of that group in the U.S. population. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, you've described the prosecution of Roger Stone as righteous. That's clearly something that the President and I disagree with you on. I would suggest that perhaps the prosecution of Andrew McCabe, who lied 4 times, thrice under the penalty of perjury, would be more righteous. I would suggest to you that uncovering the criminal conspiracy that existed where people in our own government were trying to convince intelligence agents and operatives around the world to destabilize our elections and to discredit our president would perhaps be more righteous. But as we sit here today, I don't think that Mr. Stone or Mr. McCabe or any of those other folks are killing anyone or burning down our buildings. And so I'd like to focus our effort on the most acute need I believe our country has. You've recently said that you believe Antifa to be a terrorist organization. What's your basis for that belief?
I'm not sure I said terrorist organization. I said we're investigating it as domestic terrorism. But Antifa, there are a number of violent extreme groups in the United States, and they're across the spectrum. Antifa is heavily represented in the recent riots. That's not to say they're the only group involved. And they have been identified as involved in a number of the violent mob actions that have taken place around the country.
And Mr. Attorney General, I saw the chairman of the Judiciary Committee recently say that Antifa is a myth, that their involvement in this violence isn't something that is real. What's your reaction to the chairman?
Well, I don't think it's a myth. Antifa can be best thought of, I think, as a umbrella term for what is essentially a movement comprised of loosely organized groups around the country. In some areas of the country, there are a number of groups, and there are sort of centers of activity. The groups, as I say, are loosely organized, but they are definitely organized. But since they have an anarchic temperament, they don't get along very well with each other. So I'm not suggesting it's a national organization that moves nationally. They tend to get organized for an event, and there's a lot of organization right before an event occurs, but we see a lot of the organization during the mob violence.
And that is a really important distinction when determining how to apply particularly our RICO laws to an organization like this. If Antifa is merely something that inspires people to go out and commit violence, that strikes me as legally distinct from Antifa being an organizing influence to assist people in committing crimes. One question I get from my constituents as they watch the death and violence and disruption and chaos in Seattle and in Portland and in other places is whether or not there's a risk that that could metastasize to other areas of the country. Have you given consideration to the risk that might befall other American communities if the Department of Justice were not to take action to protect and preserve federal property in places like Portland?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we are concerned about this problem metastasizing around the country. And so we feel that we have to, in a place like Portland, where even where we don't have the support of the local government, we have to take a stand and defend this federal property. We can't get to a level where we're going to accept these kinds of violent attacks on federal courts.
And if you did what my Democrat colleagues were asking, if you merely abandoned that federal property, allowed it to be overrun, allowed the people inside to be harmed, is it your view then that Antifa and other violent people engaged in these acts would simply stop, would simply accept that as their sole victory? Or is it your expert opinion, having dealt with a number of law enforcement and criminal cases in your legal career, that they wouldn't stop, that they would go to the next town, to the next community, and potentially inspire more violence?
There's no doubt in my mind that it would spread.
And what comfort can you give Americans in my district and around the country that you will stop this, that you will stop the burning and destruction of federal property, and that you will give confidence to regular Americans that they can go out in the streets without the risk of this terrorism?
Well, as you can see in Portland, we have a relatively small number of federal officers who have been withstanding this for almost 2 months. It's a great strain, but we cannot just stand aside and allow the federal court to be destroyed.
Thank you for your service and for your great work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General Barr, you started your testimony with eloquent words about the life and legacy of John Lewis, fighting systematic racism, voter intimidation, civil rights. The one thing that you have in common with your two predecessors, both Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Whitaker, is that when you all came here and brought your top staff, you brought no black people. That, sir, is systematic racism. That is exactly what John Lewis spent his life fighting. And so I would just suggest that actions speak louder than words, and you really should keep the name of the Honorable John Lewis out of the Department of Justice's mouth. Let me also say, you mentioned bogus Russiagate. In your opinion, as the Attorney General of the United States of America, did Russia interfere or attempt to interfere in the 2016 election?
Yes.
In your position as the Attorney General of the United States, is Russia attempting to interfere in the 2020 presidential election?
I think we have to assume that they are.
Thank you, sir. Now, let's talk about the integrity of the election, which is also something Congressman Lewis fought for. Jared Kushner implied that the president could move the election day. Can a sitting U.S. president move an election day?
Actually, I haven't looked into that question under the Constitution.
Well, 2 U.S. Code Section 7 says federal election day is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if you take that as a correct statute, is there any executive action by a president?
I've never been asked the question before. I've never looked into it.
As Attorney General of the United States, do you believe that this 2020 presidential election will be rigged?
I have no reason to think it will be.
President Trump tweeted that the election will be rigged, but he also tweeted that when he was losing to Hillary Clinton, and he tweeted that a day after Fox showed that he was losing to Trump. But I don't want to be too political. Do you believe, as the Attorney General of the United States, that mail-in voting will lead to massive voter fraud?
I think there's a high risk that it will.
Do you ever vote by mail-in ballot?
Apparently I did once at least.
But you believe that other people voting by mail could lead to massive fraud?
No, what I've talked about, made very clear, is that I'm not talking about accommodations to people who have to be out of the state or have some particular need not to, inability to go and vote. What I'm talking about is the wholesale conversion of election to mail-in voting.
You do understand that African Americans disproportionately do not survive COVID-19 coronavirus. You are aware of that?
I didn't hear the question.
You are aware that African Americans, black people, disproportionately die from COVID-19 coronavirus, correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
And not that it would be the first time that African Americans would risk their lives to vote in this country to preserve its democracy. But the suggestion is that them having the ability to vote by mail would somehow lead to massive voter fraud. But I won't stick to that.
No, I didn't say that. I just state, I think, what is a reality, which is that if you have wholesale mail-in voting, it substantially increases the risk of fraud.
But it doesn't make it likely.
That's all I said.
Now, I also saw on TV that the president said he's not sure that he'll accept the election results. Can a president just protest because he lost an election?
Protest in what sense?
Well, can he contest an election just because he simply loses?
Gore versus, Bush v. Gore was.
Well, I think that was over a slim voter margin. I'm talking about if it is very clear that the president has lost an election, does he have a remedy to contest the election?
Not that I'm aware of.
Let me go back to what Representative Bass mentioned. You mentioned the number that there were 8 African Americans killed by the police and 11 white people killed by the police.
So far this year.
If you use those numbers, that's 85% of that population is white, 15% of that population is black. But if you actually look at the deaths, according to the numbers you just gave, 42% of the deaths are African American and 58% are white. That is a glaring disparity in terms of population, and I just give you those numbers.
Well, not necessarily.
Because
I have to adjust it by the race of the criminal perpetrator.
No, I just did that for you. I'm using your numbers, and according to your numbers, African Americans are 4 or 5 times more likely than their percentage of the population to be killed by police than their white counterparts. I just wanted to give you that based on your numbers.
Actually, the studies I've seen have suggested 2 things. One, that in fact, police are less likely to shoot at a black suspect, a little bit more likely to shoot at white. However, that police are more inclined to use non-lethal force in a contact with an African American suspect. So those are in terms of the statistics, that's what it looks like to me.
Any data that you have that shows that African Americans are less likely to die at the hands of police or be shot or shot at, to me is a incorrect analysis. But I am interested in seeing it. So if you have it, please see it. I won't call it any names. But if that data exists, I would be more than happy to see it. And since you're sending me that data, can you send me the data of African Americans within the Department of Justice? How many you have in leadership ranks all the way down? Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I would remind Mr. Jordan, Mr. Biggs, and Mr. Johnson to stop violating the rules of the committee, to stop violating the safety of the members of the committee, to stop holding themselves out as not caring by refusing to wear their masks. Can we get the picture?
Is it permissible to drink a sip of coffee?
It is not permissible.
Not to drink.
We can't drink
I'm getting
coffee
ready to ask
in the
questions
room.
now. I'm getting ready to ask questions.
Mr.
And I will.
Mr. Gates is recognized.
No. He went.
He went, and that's why I took off my mask, Mr. Chairman.
It's my turn. I'm going to go.
Okay.
Mr. Jordan is recognized.
Mr. Attorney General, let's clear up a few things. Judge Berman Jackson agreed with your Stone sentencing recommendation. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, she said, I am concerned 7 to 9 years would be greater than necessary. I agree with the defense and with the government's second memorandum. So it couldn't be more clear they agreed with you.
That's right.
Lafayette Square. Would St. John's Church be standing today if you had not taken action?
Well, I think that was on Sunday. That was on Sunday night, and I think law enforcement did use tear gas. And my understanding is that night to clear the way so that the fire trucks could get in to save St. John's Church.
The church.
That was on Sunday night, though.
Understand the time frame, but would it be standing today if there had not been action taken by federal law enforcement and local law enforcement?
Right.
38 people unmasked Michael Flynn's name 49 times in a 2-month time frame. 7 people at the Treasury Department unmasked Michael Flynn's name. Is this an issue that Mr. Durham is looking into?
I've asked another U.S. attorney to look into the issue of unmasking because of, the high number of unmaskings and some that do not readily appear to have been in the line of normal business.
Wait a minute. So I want to be clear. So there is another investigation on that issue specifically going on at the Justice Department right now?
Yes.
Wow, that's great. So Mr. Durham is looking at how the whole Trump-Russia thing started. You have another U.S. attorney. Can you give us that U.S. attorney's name, or is that something you're comfortable doing? Or?
John Bash of Texas.
John Bash of Texas is looking specifically at the fact.
At unmasking.
38 people, 49 times unmasked Michael Flynn's name, and probably other unmaskings that took place in the final days of the Obama-Biden administration. Is that accurate?
Actually, a much longer period of time.
Even before that?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. I appreciate that. That's information that the committee did not know. Are peaceful protests violent, Mr. Attorney General?
No.
Do peaceful protests destroy businesses?
No.
Do peaceful protests injure officers?
No.
Do peaceful protests attack civilians?
No.
Do peaceful protests burn down buildings?
No.
The video we played, it's hard to watch. It's really hard to watch to see that happening in our great country. But there was the start of it was almost laughable, where you have the reporter saying, as a building is burning behind him, it's not generally speaking an unruly protest. It's mostly just a protest. I mean, it's almost laughable when you have the reporter saying, I guess he's saying it's not a fire, it's just a burning building. I guess he's saying it's a peaceful burning building. A few weeks ago, well, let me ask you this. I want to go right to this. Is defunding the police a rational policy?
No, I think, if anything, I'm more concerned that the police be adequately funded today and get more resources. A lot of the things we need to do to address some of the concerns people have about what they saw in Minneapolis are going to take some resources, some of the training that we have to do. And one of the difficulties in our country, it's not a difficulty, it's a fact, we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Most of them are very, very small. And so we have to find a way of training, making sure the training is pushed out.
Is it dangerous? Dangerous to defund the police?
It's extremely dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. And some of the ordinances you're seeing cities pass are also dangerous. Are you familiar with the letter that Chief of Police of Seattle, Carmen Best, sent to business owners and residents in that city?
Yes, I am, saying that, she cannot protect, she can't do her job. Her police force cannot do the job because
That's exactly what she said.
Yeah.
Gives officers, the policy they're trying to pass, thank goodness the court stopped it, the policy they're trying to pass gives officers no ability, and she emphasized no, not us, not you, Mr. Attorney, not me, gives officers no ability to safely intercede to preserve property in the midst of large, violent crowds. Mm-hmm. She also said in that letter, again, she's taken the leadership and responsibility to tell the business owners, the citizens, that she's supposed to serve. She also tells them in that letter, I've done my due diligence on informing the council numerous times. So she's saying, I tried to tell them, these people won't listen to me. And then finally she says this, and this is the scary part. This is why it's so dangerous. She says this in her letter, Seattle police will have an adjusted deployment. That's a nice way of saying, you're on your own. We can't help you. That is how scary this defund the police. And here's the kicker. These same cities sent you a letter last week. The same week Chief of Police Best does this to the residents and citizens of her city. Her mayor sends you a letter blaming the federal government for the violence that is happening in these cities. That is how ridiculous the left's position has become. I appreciate the work you're doing, Mr. Attorney General. I'm over time. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Barr, the job of the Attorney General is to defend the best interests of the people and serve as the people's lawyer. But during your time as Attorney General, you have consistently undermined democracy, undermined the Constitution, and undermined the health, safety, and well-being of the American people, all to personally benefit Donald Trump. Now, you just testified that there's no mechanism for a president to contest an election that has clearly been won by the opponent. Mr. Attorney General, what will you do if Donald Trump loses the election on November 3rd, but refuses to leave office on January 20th?
If the results are clear, I would leave office.
Do you believe that there is any basis or legitimacy to Donald Trump's recent claim that he can't provide an answer as to whether he would leave office?
I really am not familiar with these comments or the context in which they occurred, so I'm not going to give commentary on them.
Okay, thank you. He just stated that publicly about a week ago to Fox News. Mr. Barr, during a radio interview this spring with Hugh Hewitt, you praised President Trump's coronavirus response as superb, correct?
Who did?
You did.
Okay.
Over 150,000 Americans have died. More than 4 million Americans have been infected. More than 5 million Americans have lost their health care. Over 100,000 small businesses have permanently closed. More than 50 million Americans are out of work. This is not the outcome of superb leadership. What we've gotten from Donald Trump is exactly the opposite.
Well,
Let's explore.
Well, I disagree with that.
That was not a question, that was a statement. Let's explore. In February, President Trump falsely claimed that the number of coronavirus cases would go from 15 to 0 in a few days. Was that superb, yes or no?
I'd have to see the context in which it was said.
Here's the context. The number of cases didn't go down to 0. It's over 4 million. Let's go to March. In that month, President Trump said, "I take no responsibility at all for the failure in testing." Was that superb, yes or no?
It was accurate. The problem with the testing system was a function of President Obama's mishandling of the CDC and his efforts to centralize everything in the CDC when they didn't have the
Thank you, Mr. Barr.
test.
That is inaccurate. That's a myth.
It wasn't until this
That's
administration.
A lie.
It wasn't
You're
until
claiming my time. In April, President Trump irresponsibly suggested that the American people inject themselves with bleach. Was that superb? Yes or no?
That's not what I heard.
That's exactly what he said. That's what the American people heard, and you know it, and you can't defend it. Let's move on to May. In that month, on National Nurses Day, President Trump falsely called PPE shortages fake news, while nurses and other healthcare professionals resorted to wearing trash bags and ski goggles to protect themselves. Fake news. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I think the administration did a good job of mustering PPE, and the national supply of PPE was run down during the Obama administration and never replaced.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. The answer is no, it was not superb. By June, President Trump irresponsibly continued to refuse to wear a mask despite the public health guidance from his own experts. Was that superb? Yes or no?
Which guidance? The earlier guidance that the masks wouldn't work?
You know exactly the guidance that we're talking about. The CDC and Dr. Fauci in April recommended that the American people wear a mask, but Donald Trump has become the poster boy for the anti-mask movement.
Donald Trump has probably tested more than any other human being on the face of
Yeah,
the earth.
Mr. Barr, the answer is the refusal to wear a mask is not superb. Last question. In July, President Trump falsely claimed that 99% of COVID-19 cases are, quote, totally harmless. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I think essentially what he was saying is that the fatality rate relatively is very low, very low.
The answer is 150,000 Americans are dead. It has been a failure of epic proportions. In fact, Donald Trump's response to the coronavirus pandemic has been the worst failure of any president in American history. And the American people have paid the price. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Well, I guess I do. I think it's my turn to speak and ask questions. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman? Then I seek recognition, sir.
Gentleman is recognized.
Oh, bless your heart. Thank you. Attorney General Barr, Chairman Nadler opened up his statement by saying, "You can no longer hide behind a legal fiction." That caused me some consternation. I had no idea what he was talking about. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
I don't recall that phrase in what context.
Well, who knows what context? I mean, he was just kind of rattling on there, but he was attacking you and your performance in virtually everything he could, and said you can no longer hide behind a legal fiction. And I didn't see any connection with anything else he had been saying, so I wondered if you had seen anything, and apparently you didn't see anything either. The next person to ask questions was the gentlelady from California, who consistently referred to civilian federal agents as federal troops, and intimating, if you will, that Portland was peaceable until federal civilian agents arrived on the scene. Essentially, it's kind of analogous to blaming a fire department for showing up to put out a fire and then being blamed for starting the fire. Attorney General Barr, let's just have it on the record. Was there violence and attempts to burn down, vandalize the building, and attack civilian employees of the federal government prior to any other federal agents or the reinforcements being sent in of federal agents?
Yeah, my recollection is our main effort to reinforce was around the 4th of July period, and it had been going on for quite a while before that.
Let's talk about Lafayette Square for a second. Leading up to June 1st, you had violent mobs disobeying the 11 p.m. curfew. They set fire to parked cars, demolished coffee shops and banks, burned American flags, and even intentionally set fire to St. John's Episcopal Church near Lafayette Square. Secret Service and Park Police appropriate use of safe restorative force actually cleared that up. In total, however, 51 U.S. Park Police officers were injured during the weekend leading up to the perimeter expansion. Do you want to expand on the actions regarding Lafayette Park?
Right, so for the 29th, 30th, and 31st, there was unprecedented rioting right around the White House, very violent. During that time, as you say, about 50 Park Police, and a comparable number is my recollection of Secret Service. So we had about around 90 officers injured. I'm talking about things like concussions, one was operated on, and so forth. We had the president, it was so bad that, as it's been reported, the Secret Service recommended the president go down to the shelter. We had a breach of the Treasury Department. The historical building on Lafayette Park was burned down, the lodge. St. John's was set on fire. Bricks were thrown at the police repeatedly. They took crowbars and pried up the pavers on Lafayette Park and threw those at the police. Balloons of caustic liquid were thrown on the police. And it was clear when I arrived at the White House on Monday, there was total consensus that we couldn't allow that to happen so close to the White House, that kind of rioting. And therefore, we had to move the perimeter out one block and push it up toward I Street. And there was already a plan in being at that point that the Park Police and the Secret Service had worked out the night before, which was to put the perimeter further away and then give them time to put a non-scalable fence across the northern part of the park. During Monday, the factors that led to the timing of it were that movement was going to be made as soon as there were enough units in place to actually perform it, and units were very slow in getting into place throughout the day, much to my frustration because I wanted it moved before there was a big buildup of demonstrators. And also the fencing had to be delivered. And when those things were accomplished, the tactical commander in charge of the Park Police proceeded with the movement of pushing the the perimeter. So this was something conceived of long before and didn't turn on the nature of the crowd, although I would say the crowd was very unruly. And while the tactical considerations were made by the park police, they tried to respond to the situation. To say that this had to do with a photo op is, and I don't mean to analogize this to a military operation, but it's akin to saying that we invaded the Philippines in World War II so Douglas MacArthur could walk through the surf on the beach. One follows the other, but we did not invade the Philippines so that Douglas MacArthur could walk to the beach.
Thank you. Yield.
Gentleman yields back, Mr. Swalwell.
Mr. Barr, have you ever intervened other than to help the president's friend get a reduced prison sentence for any other case where a prosecutor had filed a sentencing recommendation with the court?
A sentencing recommendation?
Yeah, have you ever intervened other than that case with the president's friend?
Not that I recall, if you're talking.
Does that seem like something you'd recall, where you would?
Well, I'm saying I can't really remember my first, if you let me finish the question, I can't
a
remember.
big deal.
30 years ago, I was Attorney General.
As Attorney General now?
No, I didn't, but that's because issues come up to the Attorney General within a dispute, and I have never heard of a dispute. I've never heard of a dispute in the department where line prosecutors threaten to quit.
Well, it's a pretty big deal, and they
because of a discussion over sentencing.
Americans from both parties are concerned that in Donald Trump's America, there's two systems of justice. One for Mr. Trump and his cronies, and another for the rest of us. But that can only happen if you enable it. At your confirmation hearing, you were asked, do you believe a president could lawfully issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him? You said, no.
Not to what?
That would be a crime. You were asked, could a president issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him? And you responded, no, that would be a crime. Is that right?
Yes, I said that.
You said a crime. You didn't say it'd be wrong. You didn't say it'd be unlawful. You said it would be a crime. And when you said that a president swapping a pardon to silence a witness would be a crime, you were promising the American people that if you saw that, you would do something about it. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, Mr. Barr, are you investigating Donald Trump for commuting the prison sentence of his longtime friend and political advisor, Roger Stone?
No.
Why not?
Why should I?
Well, let's talk about that. Mr. Stone was convicted by a jury on 7 counts of lying in the Russia investigation. He bragged that he lied to save Trump's butt. But why would he lie? Your prosecutors, Mr. Barr, told a jury that Stone lied because the truth looked bad for Donald Trump. And what truth is that? Well, Donald Trump denied in written answers to the Russia investigators that he talked to Roger Stone during the time Roger Stone was in contact with agents of a Russian influence operation. There's evidence that Trump and Stone indeed did talk during that time. You would agree that it's a federal crime to lie under oath. Is that right?
Yes.
It's a crime for you, it's a crime for me, and it's certainly a crime for the President of the United States. Is that right?
Yes.
So if Donald Trump lied to the Mueller investigators, which you agree would be a crime, then Roger Stone was in a position to expose Donald Trump's lies. Are you familiar with the December 3rd, 2018 tweet where Donald Trump said Roger Stone had shown guts by not testifying against him?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
You don't read the president's tweets?
No.
Well, there's a lot of evidence in the president's tweets, Mr. Attorney General. I think you should start reading them because he said Mr. Stone showed guts, but on July 10 of this year, Roger Stone declared to a reporter, I had 29 or 30 conversations with Trump during the campaign period. Trump knows I was under enormous pressure to turn on him. It would have eased my situation considerably, but I didn't. The prosecutors wanted me to play Judas. I refused. Are you familiar with that Stone statement?
Actually, I'm not.
So how can you sit here and tell us, why should I investigate the President of the United States if you're not even aware of the facts concerning the President using the pardon or commutation power to swap the silence of a witness?
Because we require, a reliable predicate before we open a criminal investigation.
And I just gave to you, sir.
I don't consider it. I consider it a very Rube Goldberg theory that you have.
Well, it sounds like you're hearing this
And by the way, if I applied this standard,
there'd
there'd be a lot more people under investigation.
Mr. Attorney General, the very same day that Roger Stone said that, Donald Trump,
that's one of the
no surprise,
the true two standards of justice were really during the tail end of the Obama administration.
Mr. Attorney General, let's turn to the Michael Cohen case. Are you aware, sir, that Michael Cohen, after being released from prison, was asked to not engage with the media, including to write a book Were you aware that that was going to be asked of him?
Was I aware?
Yes.
No.
Do you know if anyone else in your department was aware?
Maybe I should tell you what happened.
Why don't you tell us what happened?
Okay. He was furloughed from the Bureau of Prisons.
No. Why don't you tell us why he was asked?
I will
to
tell
sign
you,
an agreement not
because something that people don't seem to understand is that his home confinement was not being supervised by the Bureau of Prisons. It was being supervised by the probation office, which is part of the U.S. court system. And it was the U.S. court system that had the requirements about not writing.
That U.S. court system called your actions retaliatory. Do you agree with that?
No, so all I know is what has been said in court before the judge and in the record, which is that the individual was then called by the U.S. court system saying that this guy Cohen is uncooperative, he's not agreeing to the conditions. And at that point, a Bureau of Prisons person made the decision that he was no longer eligible for home confinement.
Conditions that a federal judge said no other inmate had ever been asked of in his experience. Mr. Barr, you told ABC News that the president's tweets sometimes make your job impossible. But sir, your job is only impossible if you enable the president's corrupt schemes. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, the Constitution says the President shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Do you note any other limitations in the Constitution on the President's power to pardon?
No.
Has the President exceeded that power?
No.
My colleague from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, implied that in challenging the sentencing recommendation of Roger Stone, you were doing the bidding of the President. He didn't want to hear your response. I would.
Well, no, I was, Roger Stone, I never discussed our sentencing recommendation with anyone outside the Department of Justice. It was a very condensed period of time. I first heard, I made the decision that we shouldn't take a position as to the precise sentence, but should leave it up to the judge. And we should not affirmatively advocate for 7 to 9 years. And I made that on Monday, the 10th. And that night we filed, the department filed, and it didn't reflect what I had decided. So that night I told people we had to fix it first thing in the morning. So we did. As soon as I got in, we went forward with a plan to file. At that point, I learned about the president's tweet because I don't monitor the president's tweets, and I hesitated because I knew that I would be attacked for doing it, and people would make argue that I did it because of the tweet. But I felt at the end of the day, I really had to go forward with our filing because it was the right thing to do, and I'm glad the judge agreed with it.
We're learning more and more about the targeting and prosecution and extortion of Michael Flynn by partisan officials at the FBI. No one has been held accountable for this grotesque abuse of power. Knowing that agents with a political agenda can take anything that someone says, edit it, misrepresent it, prosecute it, and then extort confessions by threatening family members, and to do so with impunity, why would anyone in his right mind ever want to talk to an FBI agent again?
Well, I don't, I haven't reached judgments, and I'm not suggesting that all those facts you set forth are true, and we have not, at this point, challenged the actions of I've defended the actions of the prosecutors in this case in court. The order of business right now is, knowing what we know now, we don't think any of the U.S. attorneys in the department would have prosecuted this case, partly because of the behavior of the FBI, but also because the evidence is not there to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And part of what I'm trying to establish is that we will use the same standards for everybody before we indict anybody. And this goes for both sides. We won't prosecute anybody unless there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed a crime. And not some kind of esoteric made-up crime, but a meat and potatoes crime.
For more than 3 years, the most powerful agencies in our government took information that was fabricated by agents of a political campaign that they knew was fraudulent, used it as justification to launch an investigation alleging treason against a presidential candidate, then leaked the existence of that investigation in a manner that was clearly calculated to affect the outcome of the election, and then failing that, used it in a largely successful attempt to obstruct the duly elected president. Are you going to be able to right this wrong before it becomes a precedent for future election interference by corrupt officials in our justice and intelligence agencies?
You know, I really can't predict that. I think, as you know, John Durham is looking at all these matters. COVID did delay that action for a while, but he's working very diligently. And, you know, justice is not something you order up on a schedule like you're ordering a pizza.
Well, there are many of us who are concerned that if you were succeeded by someone like Keith Ellison as Attorney General, that this will become an institutionalized practice and the investigation of Mr. Durham will simply go away.
I understand your concern.
One more thing, a term we keep hearing from the left is, oh, these are mostly peaceful protests, mostly peaceful. It seems to me that you either are or you're not. Calling what's happening in our cities mostly peaceful protests is a lot like calling Scott Peterson a mostly faithful husband or Al Capone a mostly law-abiding businessman. There is a constitutional right to peaceably assemble. Where does that right stop?
When it becomes violence, criminal activity. You know, and that's the challenge here. I mean, you have a lot of people who are out protesting and demonstrating, and that's important First Amendment activity that we believe strongly in and try to protect. The particular violent opportunists that are involved here get into those crowds and then start engaging in very violent activity and hijack it. And a lot of protesters have been telling law enforcement and providing information to us about these people who are not with them, they're not demonstrators, but they're coming in. And a lot of demonstrators leave when that happens because they see what's happening themselves.
Would you call that violence a myth?
Gentleman's time?
No.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barr, for being here today. I'd like to ask you some questions about the legal standard for seizing and arresting protesters. Under the Fourth Amendment, it requires probable cause before you can seize and arrest a protester, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and the probable cause has to be particularized to a particular person. So if a protester was merely standing around in a crowd in the vicinity of someone else suspected of criminal activity, you cannot arrest that peaceful protester. In other words, there's no such thing as probable cause by mere association, correct?
Well, not strictly, but I'll say that, you know, you do need particularized probable cause.
Okay, and if there's no probable cause,
if someone jumps into a getaway car
correct?
and there are 3 or 4 people in there, that might be enough to give you probable cause, just those circumstances. You don't need it on each individual.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Attorney General. If there's no probable cause, you can't arrest a protester, correct?
I said at the beginning, arrest has to be predicated on probable cause.
All right. Now, an arrest can also occur whether or not the federal official says it's an arrest. So, for example, if a federal officer takes a protester into custody, transport that protester, let's say, to a federal building, detains a person for questioning, that will constitute an arrest whether or not the federal official says the person is under arrest, correct?
Well, that would require a very intensive review of all the specifics involved.
Actually, it wouldn't. In the case of Dunaway versus New York, which is black letter law for over 40 years, the question was whether the police violated the 4th and 15th Amendments when, without probable cause to arrest, they took petitioners into custody, transported him to a police station, and detained him for questioning. The answer is yes, that would constitute an arrest.
No, the answer is that, you know, Fourth Amendment is ultimately governed by reasonableness, and there can be circumstances. The question sometimes is, when does something actually become custody?
Reclaiming my time, this is not a trick question, Mr. Barr. I'm just citing you what the Supreme Court said. So here's a problem. Under the standard black letter law, which has been in effect for over 40 years, what the federal forces in Portland did was unconstitutional. Federal forces in full combat gear, in the dark of night, grabbed a protester who was peacefully standing there, forced him into an unmarked van, drove him to a separate location, searched him, detained him, and questioned him. That is what police states do. That's what authoritarian regimes do.
But I don't think those were the facts.
That's not, I haven't asked you a question yet, Mr. Barr.
Okay.
What the federal officials did was illegal because they didn't have probable cause. And how do we know that? Because Deputy Director of the Federal Protective Service, Chris Klein, admitted it on national TV. Deputy Director Klein said that the individual that they were questioning was in a crowd and in an area where another individual was aiming a laser at the eyes of officers. That's guilt by association. That's what the Fourth Amendment prohibits. Deputy Director Klein further stated that the protester was released after federal officials concluded, quote, they did not have what they needed, unquote, which again shows there's no probable cause. And it appears that federal Deputy Director Klein appears to understand that there was no probable cause because he essentially justifies that action as saying it wasn't an arrest. He calls it, quote, a simple engagement, unquote. I'm a former prosecutor. I've never heard that term, a simple engagement, because it's a made-up excuse. What these federal officials did was an arrest. They grabbed a peaceful protester, they forced him into a van, drove him to another location, questioned him. That is exactly what the Supreme Court prohibited over 40 years ago.
So
and that's not an isolated incident.
I obviously don't know that.
I haven't asked you a question yet. In a Washington Post article on July 24th entitled Operation Diligent Valor, federal agents told reporters that there's no basis for these arrests. They said, quote, at times they have grabbed an individual and taken them inside the courthouse for questioning before determining that they had no probable cause to charge him with any crime, unquote. Deputy Director Klein said that they coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office on all of these arrests. I urge you to instruct your federal officials to comply with the Constitution, and I ask you to investigate these arrests because many of them are in violation of the Fourth Amendment. We do not live in a police state. We're better than that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since Representative Liu didn't allow you any time to answer his allegations, would you care to answer any of his allegations?
Yes, I mean, obviously, I don't know all the particulars of any individual case out there, but based on my general understanding, what had happened was that when they tried to effectuate arrests of the ringleaders or the people who were engaged in violence or that they saw with lasers and so forth, and they went out, they were immediately swarmed by people in black, and there was a lot of violence, so they couldn't effectuate the arrest. So the modus operandi was changed, and based on specific information as to individuals who were seen doing things and identified, they later tried to pick them up when there was less of a risk of this kind of mob response. The fact that if you have information that someone has a laser and is using it and later pick him up and he doesn't have it, it doesn't mean that there wasn't probable cause. It means he doesn't have the laser. The question is, was it reasonable for you to rely on the information that you had and the identification of that individual? In some cases, it could be a misidentification. In other cases, it could be the person, ditched the laser. So there is a distinction between whether the person ultimately can be shown to have violated the law and whether there was probable cause for the police to make the inquiry and take them and interrogate them or ask them questions at least.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. I think I have to tell you, you probably know this, my constituents are scared. Americans are scared. I mean, they watch the TV, they see all this rioting, looting going on, statues being torn down. In Arizona, where I'm from, more guns are being sold than ever. I think there's more new gun owners than ever. And this has to stop. And I think that it's really important, as the saying goes, that in order to solve a problem, the first step is to realize there's a problem. And so I find it very disturbing, should I say, that Chairman Nadler denies that Antifa even exists. He said it to a reporter. He said on the floor of the United States House of Representatives that it was a fantasy, a made-up fantasy. And then in this very room, just recently, Congresswoman Jayapal, who represents the Seattle area, said, when I was talking about the autonomous zone and the takeover. She said, the area is just a few miles from where I sit right now, and there is no takeover. There is no takeover. She also said, lies are being spread by my colleagues in this committee. This area is perfectly peaceful. She also said, my Republican colleagues keep saying the Seattle Police Precinct was taken over by protesters. This is incorrect. Incorrect. No one has taken over that building. Mr. Attorney General, is that your understanding of what happened there? Do you agree with Ms. Jayapal that there was no takeover? It was just
Jayapal.
peaceful?
If you're going to say my name, please
Jayapal?
say it right. It's Jayapal.
Jayapal, would you agree with that? And also, in answer, why do you think these autonomous zones in Democrat-led cities are dangerous to America?
Well, starting with they're dangerous because they are purporting to keep on the outside duly constituted authority of the government. They're also, to me, outrageous because the people who are living now under this autonomous zone haven't selected the government. They've selected the duly authorized government of the city and the state. So it's quite an outrage that people would use force to take over an area. What makes me concerned for the country is this is the first time in my memory that the leaders of one of our great two political parties, the Democratic Party, are not coming out and condemning mob violence and the attack on federal courts. Why can't we just say, the violence against federal courts has to stop? Could we hear something like that?
Mr. Attorney General, I totally agree. I support what you're doing, and I support what President Trump is doing for law and order in our country, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The committee will stand in recess for 5 minutes.
Only take 30 seconds.
You guys do, our team does work fast. I can manage it. That's all I'm asking.
The committee will resume. Mr. Cicilline.
Sir, in your opening statement, you continue with your sustained effort to undermine the finding of Russian interference in our election. In March 2019, you sent a letter to the committee mischaracterizing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's finding that Vladimir Putin interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion to benefit Donald Trump. Mr. Mueller promptly sent you a letter calling you out for your mischaracterization, and you never corrected it. You then delayed the release of the full report, leaving the American people stewing with your misleading summary in support of President Trump's bogus claims that there was no collusion, no obstruction. You repeat these claims today, that there was no basis for this investigation and it was politically motivated by calling it the Russiagate scandal. But of course, in December 2019, the Justice Department's own Inspector General, your department's, Michael Horowitz, found that the investigation had been initiated properly and without political bias. Isn't that correct?
No.
It's not correct? That was not Mr. Horowitz's finding?
No. He said...
You are wrong, Mr. Attorney General. That was, he's found the investigation had been initiated properly.
He said he found...
Reclaiming my time without political bias.
He said he
found
no evidence.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Attorney. In April of this year, the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee unanimously found that Russia interfered with our elections and attempted to undermine American democracy, correct?
And I said so too.
Is it ever appropriate, sir, for the president to solicit or accept foreign assistance in an election?
It depends what kind of assistance.
Is it ever appropriate for the president or presidential candidate to accept or solicit foreign assistance of any kind in his or her election?
No, it's not appropriate.
Okay, sorry you had to struggle with that one, Mr. Attorney General. Now let's turn to the First Amendment. Americans all across this country have been exercising their First Amendment rights to peacefully protest police brutality against black people. I've read your statement, I listened to you this morning, and we're certainly aware of certain individuals who have engaged in violent acts. And we all agree that's wrong. But there was a lot missing from your statement. For example, as I'm sure you've also seen, the vast majority of protesters are peaceful. And despite that, unidentified federal agents have attempted to prevent these mothers, veterans, and peaceful Americans from exercising their First Amendment rights, even using unmarked vehicles to grab protesters off the street and using tear gas and munitions against them. You forcefully condemned protesters this morning, but let me ask you, sir, why have you not condemned the federal officers you're sending into cities without proper training who are attempting to take away the constitutional rights of Americans peacefully protesting?
I haven't condemned protesters. Protesters are good. Demonstrations are good. They're part of the First Amendment.
So let me ask
what I'm condemning is people who commit crime.
Yeah, we agree. Do you think it's ever appropriate, Mr. Barr, for officers to use force against peaceful protesters? Yes or no?
Not against peaceful protesters.
So you also don't mention in your statement today or your testimony that federal officers have even tear-gassed elected representatives. County Commissioner Sharon Myron confirmed firsthand, last night I was tear-gassed by a federal occupying force. I saw throw canisters of poison without warning into a nonviolent crowd, including elders and the vulnerable. And on July 23rd, the mayor, Ted Wheeler, was tear-gassed. He called the tactics of the officers abhorrent. These are elected representatives with grave concerns that officers are using abhorrent tactics, including tear-gassing elderly, nonviolent Americans. So let me ask you, sir, do you think it's ever appropriate to use tear gas on peaceful protesters, yes or no?
Well, the problem in these things sometimes occur because it's hard to separate people who...
Mr. Barr, my question is very specific. Do you think it is ever appropriate to use tear gas on peaceful protesters, yes or no?
It is appropriate to use tear gas when it's indicated to disperse...
On peaceful protesters?
To disperse an unlawful assembly, and sometimes, unfortunately, peaceful protesters are affected by it.
Okay, now I'm going to show you there's video evidence as well. I'm going to ask you to look at this video. Just so you know...
This is the video that's capturing the nation's attention this weekend, shot by Tribune reporter.
That video is of Christopher David, a Navy veteran, being beaten and tear-gassed by the officers. Do you think that was appropriate?
Well, I didn't see him tear gas. Seems to be gas in the area. I don't know what kind of gas it was, and I don't know whether it was directed at him.
Do you think what happened to
Inspector
Mr. David was
Inspector-
appropriate, Mr. Barr?
The Inspector General's reviewing that particular
Well,
incident.
do you think he deserved to get pepper sprayed and beaten to the point of broken bones?
As I say, the Inspector General is going to review the incident.
So, as the top law enforcement official in our country, do you think Americans who show up to peacefully protest should expect to be beaten and pepper sprayed and have their bones broken by federal officers?
Well, I don't think that what was happening immediately around the courthouse was a peaceful protest.
That's not my question, Mr. Barr.
Well, that's where that.
My question is,
that-
do you
that
think
is where
as the
that-
chief,
that's where the
reclaiming my
video is
time,
from. That's where the
reclaiming my
video is
time,
from.
Mr. Barr, my question is, do you think as the top law enforcement official in this country that Americans who show up to peacefully protest should expect to be beaten, pepper sprayed, and have their bones broken by federal officials? Yes or no?
I don't think peaceful protesters should face that.
And that's
One of the
correct. And
reasons-
isn't protecting the First Amendment freedom of Americans at least as important as protecting a building from vandalism?
I think
we fought for. I've not posed a question. We fought for a democracy, for the right to speak freely, and you are attempting to take that away. And what's worse, you're doing it for the sole purpose of furthering the president's political agenda and generating footage for Trump campaign commercials. The Justice Department is responsible for protecting the constitutional rights of Americans, not to serve as the president's personal bully or political director. And speaking of protesters, it's worth remembering every suffragette, every person who marched to end child labor, every abolitionist who demanded an end to slavery was a protester. The revolutionaries who transformed us from colonists into a nation were protesters. Protesters aren't chaos. They're deeply American examples of values, a desire for this country to be at its best self. They're righteous, sometimes they're necessary. One of America's most beloved and effective protesters, John Lewis, lies in state 1,000 feet from here in a deserved place of honor. And sir, your failure to respect the role of peaceful protest in this country is a disgrace, it's un-American, and it's important to remember what these protests are about. Black Lives Matter, abuse at the hands of police by black Americans, and I want to let you see now a video that fairly represents peaceful protest that is happening all across America that you conveniently omitted from your testimony and your statement. There was a 9-minute video shown by the other side, so I expect
Not all
the same
9,
courtesy.
only part of it.
With them,
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman yields
Mr. Chairman, just real quick. I don't think we've ever had a hearing where the witness wasn't allowed to respond to points made, questions asked, and attacks made. Not just in this hearing, not just in this committee, but every committee I've been on. So particularly when you think about the fact we got the Attorney General of the United States here.
Gentleman does not have time.
I don't want the time. I want the Attorney General to be able to have enough time to respond to accusations and questions asked him, and you guys not cut him off.
What you want is irrelevant. What's irrelevant are the rules. Mr. Stubbe is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, am I going to get an additional 2.5 minutes that Mr. Cicilline had?
The gentleman is recognized.
General Barr, thank you for your service to our country and your continued service to ensure that our country is safe. I encourage you to ignore the mob, these attacks from Democrats and the left-wing biased mainstream media. Be strong and courageous, for the mass majority of the country supports you and supports you rooting out corruption in the FBI and keeping our country safe from rioters, looters, and anarchists. I, for one, am very happy that you're at the helm of the DOJ and actually supporting the rule of law and fighting for justice. I want to touch on something that Mr. Jordan spoke about in his opening remarks. I want to focus on the Inspector General's December 9th FISA report on the FBI's unlawful surveillance of Trump campaign associate Carter Page. Isn't it true the Inspector General found the FBI under the Obama-Biden administration made 17 significant errors in FISA applications to surveil candidate Trump's campaign associate Carter Page?
I think that's right.
How many errors are acceptable when the FBI is targeting Americans?
Well, none are acceptable.
Then there was the complete Woods Files failures the FBI operated under during the Obama and Biden administration. The Inspector General found that 51 factual assertions in the FISA applications to surveil Page, 1, lacked supporting documentation, 2, the supporting document did not support the FBI's factual assertions, or 3, the supporting document showed the FBI's factual assertion was inaccurate. The Inspector General testified there should not have even been one error, yet he found 51 errors. Why is it so important for surveillance targeting Americans to be error-free?
Well, especially under FISA, which is a counterintelligence tool and doesn't have the same built-in protections that the criminal justice process would have. It's very important because you're going to be spying on Americans that you have you've demonstrated an appropriate basis for doing that, and therefore there's a special burden on the investigative agency, in this case the FBI, to have accurate information as to the basis of their surveillance. And I think the Bureau has been working very hard to correct those problems and to put in place a much more effective system of guaranteeing that the information is accurate.
Isn't it true the FBI under the Obama-Biden administration cherry-picked favorable evidence to obtain a FISA warrant to surveil Carter Page and ignored facts that cut against probable cause?
Well, I don't want to characterize. I mean, this is part of what's under review. Some exculpatory information was not passed along to the court. Let me just put it that way. That's evident in the Inspector General's report.
I'll yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Jordan.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Attorney General, do you deploy federal law enforcement to enforce federal law?
Yes.
Do you deploy federal law enforcement to protect federal property?
Yes.
Would the federal building in Portland be standing today if you had not deployed federal law enforcement?
I don't think so. There have been multiple attempts to set it afire.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I don't understand why a small contingent of marshals inside the court poses a threat to anybody's First Amendment rights. They set up a fence on federal property, I am told, around the court, and when people are arrested, it's because they're trying to come into the fence. These aren't peaceful protesters. They bring power tools to cut through the wire and so forth to get in. This is a very strange occupation of a city when you have, 100, 120 federal people behind a fence trying to protect the building, and all these people are trying to cut their way in. That is the occupation of a city?
Thank you. Did the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police president ask for your help?
Did who ask for my help?
The head of the FOP in Chicago. Did they ask for your help?
I think he did.
Previous exchange, they talked about Mr. Horowitz's report. Is there anything you'd like to add? You didn't get a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, my understanding of my recollection of the report is it didn't find there was no bias. And he made that clear in subsequent testimony. What he said was he couldn't find no documentary or other evidence demonstrating bias.
Yeah, and what would be helpful if maybe Mr. Horowitz could come in front of this committee and the individual who was raising that concern with you, Mr. Attorney General, could ask Mr. Horowitz himself about what he found in that report and subsequent reports that we have not yet had a hearing on.
The gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you. Sir, did I hear you correctly to say that the purpose of unleashing this federal agent assault with tear gas and rubber bullets and pepper spray on 2,000 nonviolent protesters in Lafayette Square was to secure and defend the St. John's Episcopal Church? Was that the purpose of it?
No, I didn't say that. I made very clear that the purpose was to move the perimeter to High Street, which had been the plan, as far as I'm aware, all day the week before.
So it was legitimate in that case.
I'm talking about the June 1st.
Yeah, the June 1st assault on a lot of people, including my constituents, and
Well,
I had to bring them to your office to talk about it.
Well, I don't think it was an assault. They were told by loudspeaker that the Park Police were preparing to clear H Street, and could they move off H Street?
Reclaiming my time, I think you said something to the effect of the St. John's Episcopal Church would have been overrun.
No, that was on Sunday night, I believe. And I hope I
Are you
have this right.
aware that the rector of the church, that the Episcopal Archbishop of Washington, and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church nationally, along with the Catholic bishop of the Archdiocese of Washington, all denounced this police assault on the civil rights and civil liberties of the people?
Did they do that before or after the fire was put out?
Well, all that I know is that they denounced what you did. And if you read what the Archbishop, the Episcopal Archbishop of Washington wrote, said that using police force to clear nonviolent protesters without notice in order to conduct this grotesque photo opportunity was antithetical to the principles of Christianity. But what I want to ask you about was COVID-19, because we now lead the world in COVID-19 case count and death count. President Trump, of course, promised the disease would magically disappear. He advertised quack medical cures like injecting people with disinfectant. He told his people to slow down all the testing and refuse for months to wear a mask. Last night, he retweeted a number of messages claiming that Dr. Fauci misled the American people by dismissing hydroxychloroquine as a cure for the disease. So now we have 150,000 dead Americans, 4 million infected, 40 million jobless. We lose more than 1,000 people every day, 1 American every 90 seconds. But you called his public health leadership superb, and you threw the weight of the Justice Department behind his campaign to shut down state public health orders in March and April. Now, if you look at the screen, you will see 2 tweets from the President of the United States: liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia. On April 17th, he retweeted the slogans of right-wing protesters that are blocking access to hospitals and trying to overthrow public health orders in those states. And you snapped to attention on April 27th. You designated a prosecutor to try to bring down those very public health orders in Michigan and Virginia. 2 days later, armed right-wing protesters and white supremacists disrupted the Michigan legislature, leveling death threats against Governor Whitmer, confronting police, taunting lawmakers, and forcing the legislature to shut down as they brandished their long guns and shouted in the faces of police officers. But you didn't send in a secret paramilitary police force on horseback to unleash tear gas, pepper spray, billy clubs, and rubber bullets against these protesters storming the state capitol in Michigan. No, you embraced their cause by joining litigation against the governors of Michigan and Virginia. Now, of course, your side lost your motions for emergency injunctions, but you got to spread Trump's message that it was time to call off the stay-at-home orders, the masking and social distancing. Here's what you said on national TV, echoing the claim in April that the cure was worse than the disease. Quote, "You can't just keep on feeding the patient chemotherapy and say, well, we're killing the cancer, because we were getting to the point where we're killing the patient." Do you remember saying that?
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Exactly what it says. You have to balance the cure with the danger, which we leave to governors. You know, I know everyone likes everyone likes to lay everything at the feet of the president, but this is a federal republic, and the president respected that. And our response has been largely run by governors. Now, for someone who claims to be so concerned about executive overreach, I haven't heard anyone talk about just keeping an eye on what the governor's doing.
Mr. Barr, with no vaccine...
And that's all the Department of Justice is doing.
No vaccine.
In the area of religious liberty.
The Supreme Court rejected your position on religious liberty 5-4 and said there was nothing wrong with applying public health orders to churches.
That was on an injunction.
Did you accept that, or you don't accept it? Well, no, we'll talk about it later. Mr. Barr, with no vaccine, no treatment, no cure in sight, You work to disarm the states of the only weapon we have against this disease, public health measures. And now we pay the price of this policy in overrun intensive care units and morgues, a shortage of coffins and refrigerated trucks, and an out-of-control pandemic, which makes us a global pariah state whose citizens cannot enter dozens of foreign countries, including Canada. Do you know what Dr. Fauci was saying at the same time that you were moving to take down those public health orders? Here's what Dr. Fauci was warning us about 3 months ago about the premature abandonment of health orders. If only you had listened. He said, I feel if that occurs, there is a real risk you will trigger an outbreak and you may not be able to control it, which in fact paradoxically...
We were not taking down public health orders. We were making narrow...
The gentleman's time is
We were calling attention to the fact...
Will you restore my time because this witness is speaking over my time?
You went over time. Let the witness respond.
He's trying to.
Gentleman's time is expired. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have a governor in Virginia who is engaged in overreach, particularly regarding the civil rights of Virginians and their expression of their religious faith. So I want to give the Attorney General the opportunity to respond to the gentleman from Maryland.
We adopted a very narrow approach of calling to the attention, usually by letter, not by lawsuit, of situations where they were treating religion worse than they were other kinds of organizations and gatherings, and the Constitution requires that it be treated the same. And we were calling those to the attention of the governors, and most of the governors that we called attention to voluntarily changed their own orders. There are a few occasions where we pointed out anomalies in the regulation, differential regulation of business, and again, mostly they were voluntarily changed by the governors. So this was not a wholesale attack on stay-at-home orders. It was just that these are very broad powers that have been ceded, basically telling everyone to stay at home and only work if you're an essential business and so forth. And therefore, someone has to keep an eye on that and make sure there's no overreach. And as time went by, there were times where, that you had these crazy rules in effect that were overly burdensome and raised constitutional problems.
I want to thank you for raising those points early, and particularly with regard to Virginia and the church out on the Eastern Shore. I want to thank you also for being here and for returning to lead the Department of Justice and right the ship and root out the rank partisanship and bias that had corrupted the administration of justice for many years. The Democrats allege that Attorney General Barr has politicized the Justice Department doing the personal bidding of President Trump, but it's not only unfounded, it's especially hypocritical in light of the politicization that occurred during the Obama-Biden administration and led by President Obama's self-described wingman, Attorney General Eric Holder. The Obama-Biden Justice Department investigated journalists, shut out career prosecutors, and flouted congressional oversight. I want to ask, particularly, even after President Trump assumed office, FBI lawyers exhibited bias against Trump while working for both Mueller and the FBI's Russia investigation, and the Inspector General couldn't rule out political animus against candidate Trump as influencing FBI abuse, correct?
That's my understanding.
The Inspector General found that an FBI lawyer altered evidence to support a FICE application to surveil Carter Page and criminally referred this lawyer to Durham for federal prosecution. The same lawyer who also worked on the investigations into Clinton's misuse, classified information, and Russia collusion expressed bias against President Trump. And the Inspector General testified back in December that he can't rule out bias. Mr. Attorney General, I'd ask, what would the consequences be to one of your Justice Department lawyers if they doctored underlying documents so they could support evidence submitted to a federal court?
In the abstract, talking generally, that lawyer would be fired.
Would they likely be disbarred as well?
Yes.
And isn't it true that the IG found that an FBI lawyer doctored an email to support probable cause against candidate Trump's campaign aide?
I think that's right.
And the same FBI lawyer worked on the Russia investigation targeting candidate Trump's campaign and was on the special counsel Mueller team investigating President Trump, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
And while working on those investigations, the Inspector General found several texts showing that animus, correct?
On that particular lawyer? I believe so.
Yes.
I can't remember the time frame of the text, but I know there were other texts.
going to talk to you about the unmasking that occurred where Mr. Grinnell released a list of 39 officials who submitted a request to unmask the identity of General Flynn from November 8th, 2016 to January 31st, 2017. 49 requests were submitted. Is that a normal number of requests for unmasking?
I mean, historically, that seems to be a high number, and the other question you have to ask is why was this after the election?
And 7 Treasury officials, including Secretary of the Treasury Jacob Lew, Deputy Secretary Sarah Raskin. Is that a normal occurrence?
You know, there are times where high-level officials can do it. I don't know enough about the specifics to get.
Yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Attorney General, what's more important, going to church or going to a protest?
It depends on the individual.
Both covered under the First Amendment, right?
Right.
Yeah, what's more important, going to work or going to a protest?
Again, it depends on the individual. You know, we're all free. We can all make our choices.
I'm talking about government limits on those activities. What's more important, government putting limits on protesting or government's putting limit on attending church?
Are they both First Amendment?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And we should treat them the same, shouldn't we?
Right.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jayapal.
Mr. Barr, on June 1st, there were protests against the murder of George Floyd and police brutality in Lafayette Park. Let us not be distracted by you or my GOP colleagues as to what these powerful and massive protests were actually about. They were about the persistent killing of Black bodies by law enforcement, and finally, an awakening in America of the conscience of our country. And yet, your response, Mr. Barr, was to direct federal officers to close in on the protesters and to use shields offensively as weapons, tear gas, pepper balls, irritants, explosive devices, batons, and horses to clear the area just so the president could get a photo op. So I do want to ask you, do you think that your response, do you think the response at Lafayette Square to tear gas, pepper spray, and beat protesters and injure American citizens who were just simply exercising their First Amendment rights was appropriate?
Well, first, it's my understanding that no tear gas was used on Monday, June 1st.
Mr. Barr, that is a semantic distinction that has been proven false by many fact checkers.
How is it semantic?
Do you think?
How is it semantic? Tear gas is a particular compound.
You talked about chemical irritants, and it has been proven false by reports. So just answer the question. Do you think that it was appropriate at Lafayette Park to pepper spray, tear gas, and beat protesters and injure American citizens?
Well, I don't accept your characterization of what happened, but as I explained, the effort there was...
Mr. Barr, I just asked for a yes or no, so let me just tell you, I'm starting to lose my temper. According to sworn testimony before the House Natural Resources Committee by Army National Guard officer Adam DeMarco, who was there, this was, quote, an unprovoked escalation and excessive use of force against peaceful protesters.
Well, I don't remember DeMarco as being...
Mr. Barr, excuse me, this is my time. Sir, the president told governors on a telephone call that the way to deal with the protesters of police brutality and systemic racism like in Lafayette Square is that, quote, you have to get much tougher. You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. These are terrorists. And he also talked about you on that call, sir. Here's what he said. He said, the Attorney General is here, Bill Barr, and we will activate Bill Barr and activate him strongly. Do you remember that call, Mr. Barr?
Yes, I do, but he wasn't talking about protesters. He was talking
Mr.
about
Barr,
rioters.
apparently the president believes that you can be activated to implement the president's agenda and dominate American people exercising First Amendment rights if they're protesting against him. But let's look at how you respond when the protesters are supporters of the president. On 2 separate occasions, after President Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," to subvert stay-home orders to protect the public health of people in Michigan, protesters swarmed the Michigan Capitol carrying guns, some with swastikas, Confederate flags, and one even with a dark-haired doll with a noose around its neck. Are you aware that these protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded?
No,
You're not aware of that?
I was not aware of it.
Major protests in Michigan. You're the Attorney General, and you didn't know that the protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded. So obviously you couldn't be concerned about that.
Well, there are a lot of protests around the United States, and on June 1st, I was worried about the District of Columbia, which is federal.
In certain parts of the country, you're very aware of those, but when protesters with guns and swastikas
I am
and Confederate
aware of
flags, excuse me,
protesters
Mr.
in the
Barr,
federal
this is
government.
my time, and I control it. You are aware of certain kinds of protesters, but in Michigan, when protesters carry guns and Confederate flags and swastikas and call for the governor of Michigan to be beheaded and shot and lynched, somehow you're not aware of that. Somehow you didn't know about it, so you didn't send federal agents in to do to the president's supporters what you did to the president's protesters. In fact, you didn't put pepper balls on those protesters. So the point I'm trying to make here, Mr. Barr, that I think is very important for the country to understand, is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president. You take an aggressive approach to Black Lives Matter protests, but not to right-wing extremists threatening to lynch a governor if it's for the president's benefit. Did I get it right, Mr. Barr?
I have responsibility for the federal government, and the White House is the seat of the executive
Mr. Barr, let me just
branch,
make it clear.
not
You
for
are
the-
supposed to
the Michigan
represent
authorities
the
can
people
handle-
of the United
Michigan
States
authorities
of
can
America,
handle-
not violate people's First Amendment rights. You are supposed to uphold democracy and secure equal justice under the law, not violently dismantle certain protesters based on the president's personal agenda.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to also introduce into the record a report from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, which says that over the past 20 years, more than 250 million ballots have been cast by mail, and the fraud rate is 0.00006%.
Without objection, Mr. Eschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, AG Barr, for being here today. I truly appreciate it, and I'm sincere when I say it's an honor. Yeah. AG Barr, let me just...
Could I just ask you for 1 minute, though?
To respond, yes.
Yeah. As I made clear, moving H Street out to I Street as the perimeter was a decision made the day before. It was justified by the extreme rioting that was going on around the White House. I don't remember Captain DeMarco, who was the same Captain DeMarco who ran as a Democratic candidate for Congress in Maryland, even being close to the discussions as to what was going on. Now, the fact is that the movement was not geared to the behavior of that particular crowd. It was geared to the fact that we were moving the perimeter out so we could put a fence up on H Street, by H Street. But it is a fact that the Park Police reported, and I saw myself, projectiles being thrown from that crowd. So I did not consider them all peaceful protesters. But I'm sorry. Thank you for giving me that opportunity.
You're welcome, AG Barr. AG Barr, I'd like to also talk about the violent protests that are being seen in Seattle, specifically Chaz, and also Portland, Oregon. As you know, over the course of June and early July, several shootings occurred inside Seattle's police-free zone, including the tragic murders of a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old. There were numerous reports of robberies, assaults, and property destruction as well.
Sexual assaults as well.
Yes, and despite all this chaos, all this violence, it took The Seattle mayor literally weeks to declare this an unlawful gathering, and took weeks before the police were allowed to clear that area. In similar circumstances, let's talk about Portland, Oregon. It's been going through 8 weeks of violent rioting in the streets as well. Rioters continue, in fact, to fire projectiles and mortar-style fireworks at federal law enforcement officers, and are using dangerous lasers, which have already permanently blinded at least 3 federal officers. Yet our own Chairman Jerry Nadler, told a reporter on Sunday that the anarchy and violence going on in Portland, and I quote the chairman, is a myth that is spread only in Washington, D.C., end quote. Attorney General Barr, is it in fact a myth that there's anarchy and anarchist groups engaging in violence in Portland?
I think there are anarchist and far left groups that are involved in the violence in Portland. I actually think that the chairman's comment was about Antifa. I don't know exactly what he said, but I thought he was referring to Antifa.
Well, do you think it's a myth that Antifa is involved in this anarchy?
No, I think Antifa is involved in Portland.
So either way, the chairman's comments were not correct, were not accurate.
I didn't consider them accurate.
What about the autonomous zone in Seattle? Congresswoman Jayapal has said, and I quote, that it's a peaceful protest zone. Is it a peaceful protest zone?
No, as I already said, it's outrageous that people set themselves up and over a piece of territory where the people in there have not selected them as the government and try to exercise sovereign authority. That's an outrage, and we saw people handing out guns to people to quote keep the peace and so forth. It was anarchy there.
Your office has already charged several violent protesters with federal crimes. Can you just briefly elaborate on those crimes?
Well, they're the whole gamut. I think we've had 224. They run the gamut from throwing Molotov cocktails to assaulting a police officer, that kind of thing.
Thank you, AG Barr. I just want to say that I think, and I don't know if you agree, that Chaz and Portland are really like political experiments. They really show us what would happen if we fully embrace the radical ideology of the social justice Democrats. And now, according to Democrats, it's the summer of love. According to the Congresswoman that represents Seattle, it's a peaceful protest zone. Attorney General Barr, in reality, these cities are experiencing violence, chaos, and frankly, just anarchy. So I think this political experiment has showed us that the liberal, social justice, Democrat-style government has failed. Would you like to comment on that, Attorney General Barr?
Well, when I was first going through confirmation, I expressed concern about violence getting into our political system, and we'd seen this intolerance and attacking people, and I was very worried about that. And now we've seen it sweeping through the country like this, and I hope the Democratic Party takes a stand against the violence.
Thank you, and I yield my time.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, during your, over here.
I'm sorry.
Over here in the corner. Earlier during your testimony, you talked about gun violence, and you asked the question, what about those lives? And yes, Mr. Barr, those lives do matter. But do you believe that police officers should be held or held to a higher standard?
Yes, and someone mentioned my comment about we shouldn't permit resistance. We shouldn't take that as a matter of course, but I never suggest that just because someone resists, that justifies whatever's done.
Thank you so much for that, because good police officers also believe that they're held to a higher standard. So I'm glad to hear you say that. As a former police detective, I've solved many cases based on patterns of behavior, and there is an alarming pattern, I believe, that's developing. It appears, Mr. Barr, every time a U.S. attorney investigates the president or those close to him, he or she is removed and replaced by one of your friends. You have removed U.S. attorneys in the Eastern District of New York, the District of Columbia, and the Eastern District of Texas. On June 19th, you announced Mr. Berman would be stepping down. Now, let me just be clear. When you told America that Mr. Berman was stepping down, Did Mr. Berman tell you he was stepping down?
No.
Okay.
But stepping down is the language that I'm told.
He did not tell you that.
No.
Okay,
But it's the language we usually use to leave flexibility as to whether the person is doing it on their own.
On June 20th, when asked about the basis for Mr. Berman's removal, on the very day you announced he was being fired, stepping down, the president's personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, suggested that, and I quote, "The reason may lie in the fact that Berman's office got involved in what Giuliani described as baseless investigations." Sir, if that wasn't true, if you didn't remove Mr. Berman because he was overseeing investigations of the president and those close to him, why would the president's personal attorney think that?
I'm sorry, what did he say and when? I didn't hear the quote.
Mr. Giuliani suggests that...
When?
June 20th. June 20th. That he may have been fired because he was investigating baseless investigations.
Well, if he said that, that's nonsense. Number one, anyone familiar with the Department of Justice would say that removing a component head is not going to have any effect on any pending investigation.
Okay, and I know you're aware of reports that Berman's office was in fact investigating the president's former personal attorney, Mr. Cohen, his current personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, his current personal attorney's associates, and his presidential inauguration. Well, Mr. Barr...
I don't mean to suggest just by my silence that I'm confirming that. That seems to be your opinion.
Okay, all right. Have you in any way attempted to influence or interfere with any investigation in the Southern District, including the investigations I just mentioned?
I have not interfered in any investigation. I've raised questions on occasion about certain matters, but as far as I'm aware, the office was satisfied with the resolution.
Your efforts to remove him bypassed the normal operation of law. Now we know the OLC opinion indicates that a sitting president cannot be indicted or criminally prosecuted, because you made sure President Trump understood that in your 19-page or however long job application. However, you are aware the special counsel confirmed that a sitting president can be investigated. You did read that in the special counsel's report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Given Mr. Trump's residence and former business location, the Southern District, Berman's office would have decision-making authority over whether to investigate the president himself, and you removed him.
I've explained why I removed him.
Okay, sitting here today under penalty of perjury, do you still maintain, as you stated in a February 13th interview, that the president has never asked you to do anything in a criminal case? Yes or no, please?
Yeah, no. I mean, will I confirm it? Is that the question?
Do you stand by your testimony or your...
He has never asked me, directed me, pressured me to do anything in a criminal case.
Okay, all right. You are aware, and I think you had this conversation earlier with one of my colleagues, that the president's former attorney, Mr. Cohen, was released early from prison due to concerns of COVID-19.
Yes.
Okay, and why did you support the decision to send Mr. Cohen back to prison?
I didn't even know the decision to send him back.
Did you support it based after you?
Well, I haven't looked into it enough, but my understanding of why it happened was...
Mr. Barr, as a former...
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
The president has made a mockery of the Department of Justice, and I believe as the nation's top cop, no one should care more about that than you.
The Bureau of Prisons...
Mr. Armstrong is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 10 years ago this summer, in July, in my hometown, it was a beautiful day. People were golfing, kids were swimming, everybody was playing baseball, just a perfect, gorgeous, sunny summer day in Dickinson, North Dakota. And in the span of 8 minutes, a tornado came through and caused unbelievable economic devastation. I don't think anybody woke up the next morning and said it was a mostly peaceful day. And I want us to talk specifically about what's going on in Portland with you, Mr. Attorney General, because for 61 nights, the federal courthouse is under siege. But not just the courthouse. Federal agents are under siege. You have men and women there protecting that courthouse. Now, I have no doubt if they were there, that courthouse would not be standing right now. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And I think one of our problems is how we talk about this and how it's covered versus what is actually going on every single night in Portland at that courthouse. Can you explain what your officers and your agents are going through over there?
Yes. I'm talking about the U.S. Marshals who were in the courthouse. They have initially tried to contain themselves in the courthouse. There have been efforts to push through in the main door. When people have succeeded in breaching the courthouse, they have thrown kerosene and fireworks and started fires. So then the effort was to make sure that they cannot breach. There still have been breaches into the courthouse. But basically, they try to remain in there. And starting after the 4th, they tried to arrest the people who were directing fireworks. They would climb up onto the side of the court, break windows, shoot fireworks in. And whenever the marshals came out to try to put an end to that or interdict it, they were shot at with slingshots. Lasers were constantly being put into their eyes even when they're inside the courthouse. There's a good description of it in an AP story.
I was just going to quote that. We don't have to take your word. I watched as injured officers were hauled inside. In one case, the commercial firework came over so fast the officer didn't have time to respond. It burned through his sleeve, and he had bloody gashes on both forearms. Another had a concussion from being hit in the head with a mortar.
Right. That's right. And, we've had a lot of injuries out there, and these are people who this Congress has charged with protecting federal courts. They're directed to protect federal courts in the U.S. Code, and they are under attack. And they're being injured, and it's been constant for 60 days.
Acting Secretary Wolf has said that the violent mobs are publishing personal information of federal officers, jeopardizing not only them, but their families. Why is doxing federal agents so dangerous, and are you concerned about it?
Well, it's dangerous because people can take retaliation against their homes, their families, or them, when they're by themselves. I see some of these Latin American countries in Central America where the police are very, very brave because the gangs they're trying to deal with go to their houses and kill their families. And, you'd never think that could happen here, but you could never think some of the stuff we're seeing today could ever happen here.
Is being burned by essentially improvised explosive device, being blinded by lasers, is this something that typically happens with federal marshals in federal courthouses?
No, not at all.
How is this handled? How is this going for recruitment, morale? How are they doing? I mean, I generally want to know, how are they doing?
Well, I think that AP story, gives you a feel. They feel that's their duty, and they feel that's where they have to be. A number of them are from that area, but they're extremely tired, and we've had to rotate in some more. We're put in some more people because they're very, very tired, and you make mistakes when you're tired.
Well, and I think that's an important part, because I think one of the most amazing parts of this whole thing, it started with under 30 agents there, now it's still under 100. 61 nights in a row, they defend against a siege, fires, burning down these things. You know what's the most amazing thing? They get up every morning and that courthouse is still running. They're still conducting the federal government's business. So I'm gonna say something that I think should be said a lot more often. Tell them thank you. Tell the courthouse personnel thank you. Tell the clerks thank you. Tell the prosecutors thank you. Tell the judges thank you. And if you can handle it, can you tell the public defenders thank you too? Because they're still conducting the business. They do this every single night. Are they getting sleep?
The marshals are having a difficult time because their demonstrators go to the hotel. They also go from hotel to hotel because the demonstrators try to disrupt their sleep at the hotel.
And there's a difference between a protest and a riot. Every night at some point in time in Portland, it turns into a riot. Eventually, when you wake up the next morning and you know what's going to happen again, then we need to figure out a way to stop it. Yeah. And then just one last question. Why would we have to negotiate a ceasefire with a peaceful protest?
Yeah, correct. But why would, that's right. We don't want, what we would like to see, and all we would like, is what we see in the rest of the country, which is state and local law enforcement taking care of their own city and taking care of the streets around the courthouse.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Correa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Barr, welcome. Let's talk a little bit about the census if we can. As you know, that's the process where every 10 years we decide how many congressional seats each state gets, how much funding for schools, healthcare, other issues each region gets. Let's talk about the President's memo directing the Commerce Secretary to exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment count of the 2020 census count. Mr. Barr, President is essentially saying something, trying to do that, something that's unconstitutional and illegal. 14th Amendment, and I quote, representatives shall be apportioned among several states according to their respective numbers, counting whole numbers of persons in each state. And then federal law, as you know, 2 USC subsection 2A, and I quote, the President shall transmit to the Congress a statement showing the whole number of persons in each state. Did I read those correctly, sir, more or less?
Yes.
Do you agree that the President's memo essentially violates the Constitution?
No.
Are undocumented people not whole individuals?
Or not what?
Are undocumented individuals in this country not whole people?
They are obviously people, but the legal issue there was the terminology of the Constitution.
Well, if I may,
it reflects the decision at the time of the Constitution that they count inhabitants.
I may reclaim my time, sir. You used to work for the Department of Justice back in 1989. There was a letter written to Senator Jeff Bingham by the DOJ on point. If there's a slide, there's a letter, and I would ask unanimous consent to admit that to the record.
Without objection.
And I quote, in the past, the Department of Justice has taken the position that Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, that the original apportionment and census clause of Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, requires that inhabitants of states who are illegal aliens be included in the census count. And in our view, this issue today, we have found no basis for reversing that position. Are you reversing that position now?
Well, I think what the department advised is that this came up because Alabama claims you cannot count illegal aliens in the census under the Constitution. The department looked at it and advised that Congress can determine the meaning of inhabitant for this purpose, that it is not a self-defining term as they
only got 2 minutes, sir.
That they recognized.
Mr. Barr, if I may.
Yeah, but this is a hearing. I thought I was the one that was supposed to be heard.
Well, and I'm going to get there. The current dispute, you talked back when the Supreme Court struck down the president's attempt to put a citizenship question on the census. At that time, the president announced an executive order to collect citizenship information by other means. And at that time, you made reference to a current dispute over whether illegal aliens can be included in the apportionment purposes. Is that what you're referring to now, sir?
I think that I could have been referring to the Alabama case.
So
I can't remember.
Is the DOJ studying this issue? Have you concluded?
Yes.
Can you provide this committee with discussions, any research, any concluding memos on that issue?
I'll look into it. But we have considered it, and as I said, our advice has been that Congress does have the power to define the term inhabitant to either include or exclude illegal aliens.
But we're talking about the president's executive orders.
Well,
sir.
Congress has delegated that power to the Commerce Secretary. So as the law stands now, we think the Commerce Secretary, as the delegate of congressional power, can define that term. That's a reasonable argument to make.
Mr. Attorney General, in the last few seconds I have, President has to be within the law. Nobody is above the law in this country, including the President of the United States. My concern is he goes around doing tweets, memos, dictums that are clearly unconstitutional. My district, sir, is a working class, hard-working community. Immigrants, the greatest generation. All we want is equity based on the census. We want to make sure we get our federal dollars like everybody else around the country. We want to make sure that our representation is equal, individual, in Orange County as it is in other parts of the country. All we ask for is respect, sir. I ask you, please tell the president, stop tweeting things, stop writing memos that are clearly unconstitutional. Thank you very much, and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General Barr, will you send a thank you to the law enforcement people that work for you for the work that they're doing here across the United States of America? Sure. And I want to thank all the law enforcement across our country. We are an imperfect country, but law enforcement has done they do a good job across our country, and they should be recognized for that. I'm going to ask you a question about Mr. Burnell Trammell from Milwaukee here in just a minute. He was the man who was shot to death at the end of last week. He's the African-American man who was wearing a sign, and he's regularly known around Milwaukee for carrying a Trump for President sign. But I want to share with you what happened in Madison, Wisconsin, so we all understand that this is not a myth about Antifa. So when the riots hit Minneapolis and then extended around the country, they hit Madison, Wisconsin also. And I don't know if you've ever visited Madison, Wisconsin. There's an iconic street there called State Street. Starts at the Capitol and runs all the way down to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that street, if you go there now, 75 businesses are boarded up as a result of a mayor and city council who would not protect those people. Those people went to the city council last week and they asked for some assistance. The city council, who would not protect their business, they said, no, we're not going to provide you for assistance. Shortly after State Street was destroyed, and by the way, it's disappointing in some of the film that I've seen that the police cruiser that went flaming down State Street was not included in that. But shortly after that, about a week afterwards, two monuments at the state capitol that I used to walk by all the time were torn down. One was of Hans Christian Heg, who was the abolitionist Norwegian immigrant who died at Chickamauga defending the Union and providing for the end of slavery, fighting for the end of slavery here in the United States. The other monument that was torn down, by the way, they took a tow truck and tore it down, was Lady Forward. Lady Forward is there because of women's suffrage. Wisconsin was the first state to pass suffrage back in the early 1900s here in the United States of America. Those were torn down. Just yesterday, a woman, a social worker who teaches at a local school just outside Madison in Mount Horeb, she was charged with beating a state senator, a Democrat state senator. Her name is Samantha Hamer. Hopefully she will be given justice. But I want to emphasize to my colleagues on the left that if you think you're insulated from Antifa, which is supposedly a myth, you should really think about that, because them and other radicals, they will not spare violence on anyone. Their anarchy is meant to destroy our country. And I would ask you to, if you want to contact a former colleague of mine, State Senator Tim Carpenter, a Democrat, he'll tell you he was beat to a pulp on that night at midnight when they were tearing down those statues. It is not a myth. So, Mr. Attorney General, I would ask Mr. Burnell Trammell, I don't know if our Attorney General Call in Wisconsin or the mayor of Milwaukee are going to pursue what appears to perhaps be a political execution. Are you familiar with that situation in Milwaukee?
You mean the shooting of that gentleman?
Yes.
I've read about it.
If the Attorney General and other law enforcement in Wisconsin do not act, will the federal government study this situation and bring justice for Mr. Trammell and his family?
Yes, we'll certainly study that situation.
This is not a myth. You're hearing it from all over the country, and we're hearing all the time about Portland and Seattle. This happened in Madison, Wisconsin also. where a mayor, a far leftist mayor, proudly carries that banner, sat on a street, actually not a street, a highway with protesters and shut down traffic. And then State Street, one of the most iconic streets in the state of Wisconsin and Madison, was destroyed. And I'm not so sure that those businesses are going to get their businesses back. It is not a myth, folks. What's happening is real across our country, and we need to stop the riots. These are not peaceful protests. These are riots that are happening, and we need to call an end to it. And I hope you, Mr. Attorney General, will work towards that end. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon.
Attorney General Barr, I wanted to follow up on some questions from one of my colleagues. You testified earlier that you have at times voted by mail. Is that correct?
I remember, I think, once voting by mail.
So if public records show you voted by mail in 2012 and 2019, you'd agree with that?
I think, I can't really remember the details.
Okay.
I think on one occasion I had to go to a station and
Okay, but
vote
you did
before
at
the
least
election.
once
And
vote
I think
by
in
mail.
another one I voted by
reclaiming my
mail.
time, sir.
Yeah.
I raise this because in May of this year, 800 public health experts from across the nation sent a letter urging Congress to, quote, prepare for a presidential election by mail to allow Americans to vote from home and assure their health and safety. You're aware that health experts have emphasized that voting by mail is critical to protect public health in this upcoming election, correct?
When was that?
In May of this year. If you're not aware of it, I can provide
Okay.
this to
I'd be interested in
your
seeing.
staff.
Yeah.
Great, I have an extra copy for you. So that public health advice is really important to citizens in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because we have a large population of seniors who are at higher risk for the coronavirus. They shouldn't have to choose between risking their lives and exercising their right to vote. But the problem we're facing is that the president has repeatedly sought to cast doubt on the security of mail-in ballots, saying that the 2020 election could be rigged with, quote, millions of mail-in ballots printed by foreign countries, end quote. And you, sir, have repeated this disinformation.
Well, it's not
Barr,
disinformation.
I don't have a question for you yet. Here it comes, though. Last month, you echoed the president's conspiracy theory when you suggested in at least 3 interviews that, quote, foreign countries could manufacture counterfeit ballots, end quote, to influence the presidential election, correct? You did that in at least 3 interviews?
Yes.
Okay. But in fact, you have no evidence that foreign countries can successfully sway our elections with counterfeit ballots, do you?
No, I don't, but I have common sense.
Okay, well, and that's what you responded when you were directly challenged on that. You said, no, you didn't have evidence, but it was obvious. According to state election officials, your alleged concerns here are not obvious, but in fact are outrageous. Every state in the union has absentee ballots. 2/3 of the states allow for vote by mail for any reason. 5 states, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Utah, vote entirely by mail and have done so for decades. Even the U.S. military uses mail-in ballots, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So isn't it true that after you suggested without evidence that foreign adversaries could sway our elections using counterfeit ballots, election experts and officials from around the country said that what you suggested was virtually impossible, preposterous, would never happen, and would be readily detected due to the multiple levels of security used with mail-in ballot systems?
There are not multiple levels of security.
Okay,
used
well,
with
so
mail-in. and I don't agree. I
recall-
don't agree that it's a
Okay, reclaiming my time. And again, I'm happy to supply you with the statements that were
Before
provided
Donald
from around
Trump
the
raised
country.
concerns about it,
In
every
fact,
major publication.
Reclaiming my time, sir. In fact, there is no evidence that foreign countries can make counterfeit ballots and create a real threat to our election security. Are you aware that in May, the president tweeted, and I quote, mail-in voting will lead to massive fraud and abuse. It will also lead to the end of our great Republican Party, end quote.
I wasn't aware of that tweet.
Well, that tweet suggests, sir, that the president is spreading disinformation about mail-in ballots because he's afraid that if more people vote, he and his party will lose. The fact, Mr. Barr, is that our foreign adversaries cannot actually influence our elections by submitting massive counterfeit ballots, but the FBI and our intelligence services have repeatedly warned that those adversaries are actively trying to sow mistrust of our election systems, and by repeating disinformation about mail-in voting, you and the president are helping them. Just switching gears, you would agree.
Well, I'd like an opportunity to respond to
You would agree that prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with a political party, wouldn't you?
Who makes contributions?
You said in 2017 that prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with a political party,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
And in fact, you and your wife have donated over $730,000 to Republican and conservative candidates, including donations of $58,000 to Republican senators and Senate candidates in the 4 months preceding your confirmation. That's correct,
Are you
isn't it?
surprised I'm a Republican?
Is that correct that you made those donations?
Over a long period of time.
Including just before?
That's a cumulative of a long period of time, but basically,
Mr.
I never
Chairman,
hid the
I
fact
yield
I'm a
back,
Republican.
and
I was
would
talking about
also-
career prosecutors have generally historically avoided making contributions, was my view.
$730,000 is not.
Time of the gentlelady has expired, Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to introduce the 800, the public health expert letter signed by 800 individuals, the Attorney General's repeated interviews in which he suggested that our elections could be undermined, the overwhelming reaction from election officials around the country, and the articles concerning his campaign donations. Thank you.
Without objection, the articles will be entered into the record. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, your department released Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign manager, early from prison in May out of concern for the coronavirus. In March 26th and April 3rd, your department released guidelines, criteria by which, setting priorities by which people would be released early. By your own department's admission, Manafort did not meet that criteria. Since the start of this pandemic, we have repeatedly urged you to use your authority to protect vulnerable populations in prisons, and instead you released the president's former campaign manager. Sir, do you know how many federal inmates have tested positive for COVID-19 as of today?
Yeah, I have that number.
Quickly, sir, because the clock ticks.
Well,
we have a slide, if they'll bring it up, that shows us that 10,000 inmates have tested positive and over 1,000 staff have tested positive. Do you know how many have died?
about 100, almost 100, I think.
That's right. It's about 99 inmates have died, and yet only 5% have been released under your guidelines.
7,000.
You stated in May that you were taking, quote, every measure we can to protect federal inmates. The numbers, however, tell a different story, as do your actions. Despite releasing Manafort, your lawyers continue to argue against the release of prisoners. In April, vulnerable prisoners who suffer from serious at-risk health conditions like chronic asthma, heart disease, and kidney disease filed a lawsuit for early release in Ohio. These prisoners were being, quote, overcrowded in like cattle because prisoners were not able to social distance them. 550 prisoners sought release, yet your own department processed only 7 applications and denied them all. Yet you had time to process Manafort's application.
I didn't process Manafort's
Well, your
application.
department did, sir. But apparently not these vulnerable Americans living at grave risk. In fact, in a series of rulings in April and May, an Ohio District Court ordered that your department, quote, act with urgency and to, quote, move inmates out due to continued risk of harm to prisoners and to government staff. And sir, your department challenged that court order, did it not?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, you all did. You did not help move these inmates out as ordered. In fact, you tried to block the district court's order. However, the Supreme Court on May 26 rejected your department's request. Sir, 9 prisoners had died, and it's been 2 months since the Supreme Court's order. Do you even know today how many of those prisoners have been released or how many more have died?
No, I don't. You know, we had 100, we started out this with 170,000 prisoners, so we've lost.
I just need you to try to explain to me and to America, how is it that the former campaign manager of the President of the United States who did not meet the priority criteria, got released, even though your own department admitted he didn't meet the guidelines, but all these other folks were not? If it was deadly enough of a virus that you needed to protect the former campaign manager, why not all of these Americans who also are vulnerable and have at-risk conditions? Mr. Barr, the contrast says it all. And it is not just in Ohio. In fact, in my own home state in Texas, a federal prison housing women with mental and medical health issues just confirmed last week that of the 1,357 prisoners, over 500 tested positive for COVID. One prisoner recounted, "We're like a whole bunch of hamsters in a cage, chasing our own tails, and yet none have been released." Mr. Barr, have you seen those statistics, yes or no?
I put out guidelines, general guidelines, to propel the release of.
Not released anyone.
I put out general guidelines.
One of those prisoners is a mother, Andrea Circle-Bear, who had to give birth on a ventilator in that facility because your department prioritizes releasing Paul Manafort instead of vulnerable Americans. A few weeks after this photo, Ms. Bear died, along with 2 other women housed in this facility from COVID-19. Sir, you could be saving lives by reducing the prison population. Yet you have blatantly abandoned your duty to these women. You have shamelessly abandoned your oath of office to protect all Americans impartially because you have prioritized giving special favors to the president's friends. This is not equal justice under the law. It's not the law that you and I both learned in law school. It is 2 simple systems of justice, one for the president's friends and one for everyone else.
The director of the BOP.
It is flat wrong.
Yeah, the director.
And I yield back.
Yeah, the director of the BOP testified under oath that no one from Justice Department was involved.
Gentlelady yields back.
Yeah, but the gentleman has not been given an opportunity to respond, and that's been a consistent problem.
Mr. Neguse is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General. I want to go through a couple of your prior statements. On April 18th of 2019, you stated, quote, that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You're aware of that?
Mm-hmm.
Today, yes or no, Mr. Barr, under the penalty of perjury, do you testify that that statement was true at the time you made it?
I thought it to be true at the time I made it.
Why
isn't it true?
June 9th, I'll get to that, Mr. Barr.
I mean, does it have to do with quibbling
I will get
over?
to that. Reclaiming my time, you answered the question.
Okay.
I have another question for you. On June 19th of
No,
2020.
actually, I need to answer that question.
Mr. Attorney General, you did answer the question.
No, you said under penalty of perjury. I'm going to answer the damn question.
You
okay?
said the answer was yes, is what you said.
Well,
are you saying no?
I think what I was referring to, and I'd have to see the context of it, was the supplying of documents.
No, Mr. Attorney General, this statement was not limited to the supply of documents. You stated at a press, Mr. Attorney General, reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
I think that's what I was talking about.
On April 19th of 2019 that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You knew when you made that statement that the president had not agreed to be interviewed by the special counsel. Now, on June 18th of this year, Mr. Attorney General,
I was referring to
on
the
June 18th,
production of documents.
Mr. Attorney General, on June 18th of this year, the Department of Justice issued a statement saying that Mr. Berman, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, had, quote, stepped down. You're aware of that statement being released by the department, correct?
Yes.
And do you testify today that that statement was true at the time the department issued it?
He may not have known it, but he was stepping down.
He may not have known that he was stepping down. That's your testimony today?
He was being removed.
Mr. Attorney General, The statement did not say that he was being removed. It did not say that he was being fired. It said that he was stepping down. And apparently your testimony today is that that was in fact accurate when Mr. Berman has testified under oath to this committee that it in fact was not. Now I want to talk about
No, he was removed. He was removed, and I wanted an opportunity to offer him another job.
I understand your rationalization for your answer, but the American people will let your answer speak for itself. Now, Mr. Attorney General, earlier this year, President Trump stated that he had planned to make what he described as Vice President's, quote, Ukraine dealings an issue on the campaign trail. Earlier this year, on February 10th, you stated that you had set up a, quote, intake process for submission of information, intake process, end quote, for submission of information relating to the Ukraine to the Justice Department, and that included, quote, these are your words, anything Mr. Giuliani might provide. Do you recall making those comments?
Something along those lines.
You'd concede there isn't anything standard about the Attorney General creating a special process for information related to advancing.
I disagree.
You disagree.
And I also made it clear that that is a vetting process that's available to anybody.
Is that right? Which U.S. attorney have you assigned to receive information from Vice President Biden's personal lawyers regarding President Trump?
Well, maybe if they had vetted the dossier,
maybe
if they vetted the dossier, we wouldn't have the whole
Mr. Attorney General,
problem.
there's no U.S. attorney, of course, that you've appointed to do that because what you have done with respect to this process is unprecedented. Now,
it was cautionary so that we do not pollute the criminal investigative process with Ukrainian disinformation.
I will give you an opportunity to explain this intake process. My understanding is that you have directed.
You are going to give me an opportunity?
I intend to right now. The Eastern District of New York, the U.S. attorney responsible for that district, my understanding is that you have asked that U.S. attorney to be responsible for the intake process. Is that right?
No.
That's wrong? The U.S. attorney?
The U.S. attorney in the Eastern District was given oversight of all Ukrainian-related cases, any new cases involving Ukraine.
Correct.
We face a problem with Ukraine, which is unreliable information coming in it. There's a lot of corruption there. It's a hall of mirrors.
Mr. Attorney General,
and I wanted to make sure that before we got into criminal proceedings, and this was to everyone's benefit, particularly Vice President
Mr. Attorney
Biden,
General,
that the information was scrubbed in conjunction with the intelligence community.
And that is consistent with the memo that you issued, which said, any and all new matters relating to Ukraine shall be directed exclusively to the Eastern District of New York for investigation and appropriate handling, just as you've described right now. Now, of course, the U.S. attorney responsible in the Eastern District of New York was recently changed. My understanding is a few weeks ago, you announced that Seth Ducharme would be taking over to replace Rich Donahue. Mr. Ducharme, prior
Pittsburgh is in charge of the vetting.
Mr. Attorney General, prior to taking this position, Mr. Ducharme worked at Maine Department of Justice. Is that correct?
Yes, he was a counselor to me, and then he was the principal assistant deputy attorney general.
That's right. And rather than having the acting U.S. attorney, the deputy U.S. attorney rather in that district,
they wanted to swap jobs.
You now have appointed your prior counsel to oversee that very same process. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
the gentleman yields back. Ms. McBath.
Mr. Chairman, before we go to Ms. McBath, could I enter a couple of documents ask for unanimous consent to enter 4 documents? The 2 memos I referred to, setting the guidelines for who gets released, a Washington Post article about Paul Manafort's release, and a testimony from the Council of Prison Locals 333 for the record.
Without objection, Ms. McBath is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking you, Attorney General Barr, for joining us today and for the work that the committed public servants in your department are doing to keep our country safe. But, sir, just a few months ago in May, you said that you would be taking the president's position in urging the Supreme Court to overturn the Affordable Care Act. When asked if you will still take that position, even if it means, and I quote, stripping millions of Americans of their health care in the middle of a pandemic, you stated that the case would not be argued until October and that the president expects to fix and replace Obamacare with a better system. Attorney General Barr, let's be very, very clear. As public health officials and data have shown us, this pandemic is simply not going away. Just last week, it was reported that one hospital was planning to send coronavirus patients home to die. due to limited resources to treat them. So we're still facing an extremely critical and extremely serious situation. And even if you expect the president to figure out a new plan by October, the president has not yet put in place another system, nor is there any guarantee that he will do so by October, as you, quote, expect. So when you say you expect the president to figure out a new plan, you are taking a risk with millions of Americans' lives. You are risking the lives of millions, people who will not be covered for pre-existing conditions if the Supreme Court agrees with your position. Civil servants in your own department have disagreed with you on this matter. In fact, I'm introducing a statement by one of the lead attorneys on the ACA case, Joel McElvain, who resigned in protest when your department refused to defend the law as it is required. In my district, the 6th District of Georgia, Congressional District, there are over 300,000 people that have pre-existing conditions, and I, sir, am one of them, a 2-time breast cancer survivor. Our state is continuing to battle hard against a resurgence in COVID-19 cases. So I'm asking you, sir, not to gamble with American lives, not to gamble with my life. And I'd like you to confirm that if the president has no other plan in place by October, you will reverse course and drop your position that, I quote you directly, the entire ACA must fall.
I have 2 children who are cancer survivors, so I feel very strongly about this issue as a matter of policy, and I believe that the president's made clear that he will ensure that there will...
Please answer my question. Will you stop playing politics with Americans' health care in the middle of a pandemic?
I'm not playing politics. I'm the lawyer. I'm not in charge of health care policy.
Will you reverse your course and make sure that millions of Americans like me that depend on health care and treatment to stay alive, will you reverse your course to make sure that we have the ability to be able to live in this country freely with quality health care?
People will have the health care protection, and that will be accomplished either if I lose, if the government loses the case, if the Supreme Court strikes it down, then I think...
I take this as a no. Sir, I want to
based on history, there will be...
Sir, I'd like to go on. I'd like to briefly mention my concerns relating to gun violence, because that's actually how I got to Washington.
What?
I want to briefly go on to another concern that I have relating to gun violence. That's actually how I got here.
Okay.
During the coronavirus outbreak, the nation has seen a dramatic increase in firearm sales and skyrocketing numbers of sales blocked by failed background checks. In March alone, the NICS background check system blocked 23,000 attempted sales. In other words, in 1 month, there were 23,000 attempts to get a firearm by a person who was not allowed to possess one under our current law. And it is a federal crime for anyone to lie in an attempt to get a firearm, which is what I suspect most people try to do. I'd like to know from you, how many of these March block sales were investigated?
I sent out a directive that we should start prosecuting to the extent we can these lie and try cases. Previously, we hadn't really been pursuing them.
Okay, so I take that as a no. I just have one
no,
more
I,
to say.
well,
Sir,
I'm saying we are pursuing those cases.
My time is up. I take that as a no. Unfortunately, this fits a larger pattern of your administration neglecting the health and safety of Americans. From health care to gun violence, this administration is failing to keep my constituents and people all over the country healthy and safe. I demand better. Americans demand better. I want you to provide the answers that you are either unwilling to provide us or don't have answers to this committee, because these are relevant questions and we need to have answers from you. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I got a question.
For what purpose? For what purpose does the gentleman seek?
For months you've tried to get the Attorney General to come. He's here. Why don't you let him speak? Why don't you let him answer the questions?
The gentleman is not...
Time after time. If you want the Attorney General to come, at least let him answer the questions and the accusations made against him.
The gentleman's rudeness is not recognized.
Rudeness
is on the other side.
Mr. Stanton,
Time after time, you refuse to let the Attorney General of the United States answer the questions posed to him.
Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Well, maybe the last few witnesses will actually let the Attorney General speak.
Mr. Attorney General.
Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Attorney General, thank you very much for being here. Since the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, those who have sought to suppress the minority vote concealed their intentions. The suppressors suggest that they were really out to advance some altruistic goals such as election security. But history has proven that those allegations and those rationalizations were lies designed only to fend off legal challenges. It was a dirty little secret, and those who aimed to suppress the minority vote never dared to say it out loud. But not Donald Trump. He didn't even try to keep it a secret. He just blurted it out. He said he will lose the 2020 election if more Americans are able to vote. That's one reason why this president needed a fixer at the Department of Justice. From letting Russia off the hook to rewarding Roger Stone. Mr. Barr, you've proven not only very willing, but I have to admit, very able. More than a year ago, this committee heard testimony about a resurgence of discriminatory voting practices, certain states making it more difficult to vote. These practices include unnecessarily strict photo ID requirements and the abuse of signature match requirements to reject absentee ballots. Despite that, your department has a lax approach to enforcing Voting Rights Act. During your tenure, you filed just one case to do so. But the DOJ has done nothing to block the suppression practices we heard about over a year ago before this committee. And to your credit, Mr. Barr, you warned us. You told the New York Times Magazine earlier this spring that the DOJ's role in protecting the right to vote would be limited this year, and that it would be up to the states to police themselves. Isn't that right? Yes or no?
I don't recall saying that, but if you say it's in the article.
It's in the New York Times article from just last month. In that same news story, you said it would be up to the voters to referee the election. Is that right? Yes or no?
I don't remember the context of that, frankly. Was I talking about foreign influence?
No, sir. I'll submit it for the record. You'll have a chance to review it and submit additional testimony if you desire to. Someday, when we have more time, you'll have to explain to me how a person whose right to vote is denied by a discriminatory practice can referee an election.
That doesn't sound.
But I digress. It troubles me that you have not been consistent in your approach. As the Attorney General, you have stood down on discrimination and allowed states to make it harder to vote. But you have used the DOJ as a sword when attempts have been made to make it easier to vote. Voting rights advocates in South Carolina and Alabama sought to prevent Americans from choosing between voting and risking their health by making it easier and safer to complete an absentee ballot during the pandemic. But your DOJ intervened to try to block that accommodation. Mr. Barr, did you discuss either of those cases with the president? Yes or no?
No.
The American people.
I don't even know. What two cases are you talking about?
Cases in which...
Tell me the name of the cases.
I don't have the name of the cases.
Where
South
were
Carolina and Alabama. You'll have a chance to comment after your testimony is done here today. The American people have good reason to believe that you will continue to use your authority to carry out the president's wishes to suppress the vote. And there are fears that you and the president are laying the foundation to interfere with the upcoming election, specifically with vote by mail, as my colleagues have previously noted, because both of you have advanced false conspiracy theories about mail-in voting. And I hope we can put some of those fears to rest here today. Mr. Barr, can you commit to the American people that you will not interfere with the decisions of state and local authorities to use vote by mail and absentee ballots in the 2020 elections? That's a yes or no question.
Well, I think the federal government has very limited ability to get involved in this, but I'm not going to give up whatever ability we have to ensure the integrity of the election. I've never, my observation was simply that it would inject some uncertainty into the election process, and it opens up the potential of fraud, and I think the integrity of our elections is very important.
The president has suggested that only votes counted on election day should be what matters, meaning that if a voter casts a legal ballot on or before election day, but that ballot is not counted on election day, it shouldn't count at all. So I want to ask you again about your commitment to ensuring that every vote is counted. If, in this upcoming November election, the president asks you to intervene and try to stop states from counting legal ballots after election day, will you do the right thing and refuse? Yes or no?
I will follow the law.
You won't say no, sir?
I'll follow the law.
It's very disappointing.
If a state has a law that says it has to be cast on election day, that's the law.
Will you commit to making sure the Department of Justice does not get involved in a contested election? Yes or no?
I will follow the law.
It is so disappointing that we can't get a clear answer on that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the following items. An item from The Guardian magazine, an embarrassment. Trump's Justice Department goes quiet on voting rights. Second, New York Times magazine, William Barr, state of emergency. Finally, from the Washington Post, Trump's assault on the election integrity forces question, what would happen if he refused to accept the loss?
Without objection, the material will be based.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record.
Without objection.
A member of the Judiciary Committee, following the law.
Without objection.
Following the law should be something a member of the Judiciary Committee knows. It's pretty darn clear.
The gentleman will suspend. Without objection, the material will be entered into the record. Ms. Dean is recognized.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, could we take a 5-minute break?
Ms. Dean is recognized.
Could we take a 5-minute break, Mr. Chairman?
No.
That's a common courtesy, Mr. Chairman, of every witness.
I waited an hour for you this morning. I haven't had lunch. I'd like to take a 5-minute break.
Mr. Attorney General, we are almost finished. We're going to be finished in a few minutes. Otherwise, we can certainly take a break. But
You're class act.
Yeah.
Mr. Vice, after this, if you still want, we'll have a break.
No, he wants a break now.
You want it now?
And you just mentioned rudeness. I think we're seeing it on display. Let's let the Attorney General have a break.
Committee will stand in recess now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.